In Ark Raiders, somewhere beyond the Blue Gate, a mountain of metal moves on spider legs, and everything we think we know about the Ark invasion, the machines and what they actually want, might trace back to one colossal, world-ending thing called the Emperor. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So let me be upfront about why I made this video and how I put it together. I have been deep in Ark Raiders lore for a while now, and the Emperor kept coming up as this background detail that nobody had really sat down and fully explored. There is something deliberately unsettling about how the developers placed it in the game. Visible but untouchable. Massive but patient. When I started building this video, I made one specific editorial choice early on. I decided not to present the Emperor as a confirmed boss or a guaranteed story beat, because the truth is the lore around it is fragmentary and open to interpretation. What I chose to emphasize instead is the architecture of mystery the developers built around it, and what that mystery suggests about the world of Ark Raiders as a whole. I reordered some of the lore elements to tell the story chronologically, from the world before the invasion to the Emperor's current presence, rather than jumping around the way most discussions do. Everything you are about to hear is my interpretation of the available evidence. I think it holds together well, but I want you to draw your own conclusions too. Chapter 1. The world that got hit first. To understand the Emperor, you have to understand what the world of Ark Raiders actually was before the machines came down. The setting is Earth, but it is not quite our Earth. It is a version of Earth that had already been through its own particular brand of suffering. The civilizations that existed in this world were recognizable, industrial, complex, and deeply human in all the ways that matter. People built things. People argued about things. People loved things. And then from somewhere above the atmosphere, the Ark arrived, and none of that prior human complexity had any meaningful answer for what came next. The world that got hit first was a world that had no preparation and no warning that mattered. The lore of Ark Raiders is deliberately fragmented. The developers at Embark Studios did not write a history book and publish it alongside the game. What they did instead was scatter evidence across the environment, in the architecture of ruined buildings, in the way the landscape has been reshaped by machine activity, in the occasional piece of text or audio that surfaces when you dig into the world carefully. This approach to storytelling is intentional. It puts the player in the same position as the survivors inside the game world, people who are also trying to piece together what happened and why. The fragmentation is the story, in a very real sense. You are not reading a history, you are excavating one. What we can establish fairly confidently from the available evidence is that the Ark invasion was not a gradual process. It was not a slow creep of machines appearing over decades and steadily expanding their territory. The evidence suggests something much more sudden and much more overwhelming. The infrastructure of the world did not have time to adapt. Cities did not develop anti-Ark technology through a long period of conflict. Instead, the invasion appears to have struck with a speed and a scale that simply overwhelmed everything that existed before it. This points toward an invasion that was designed to be decisive, not prolonged. Whatever the Ark are, they came prepared to finish the job quickly. The geography of the game maps reflects this history of sudden violence. The Blue Gate map, which is one of the primary environments in Ark Raiders, is a landscape defined by the aftermath of catastrophic impact. Buildings are not gradually deteriorating in the way you would expect from simple abandonment over time. The destruction has a specific character to it, a combination of structural collapse and environmental transformation that suggests the machines did not simply occupy this space. They reshaped it according to their own purposes. The ground itself has been altered. The air is different. The light has a quality that does not feel entirely natural. This is not a world that has been conquered. It is a world that has been converted. Survivors in this world did not simply flee and wait for a military response that never came. The lore suggests they adapted in ways that are genuinely impressive, given the scale of what they were facing. The Raiders, which is the player character archetype in Ark Raiders, represent a specific kind of adaptation. They are not soldiers in a traditional military sense. They are scavengers, operators, and explorers who have learned to navigate the converted landscape without drawing catastrophic attention to themselves. Their entire existence is built around the idea that you cannot fight the Ark head-on. You move through the margins, you take what you need, you survive, and sometimes, if you're skilled enough and lucky enough, you push a little further into the danger than anyone else has gone before. The economy of survival in this world is built on materials and technology salvaged from the converted zones. This is why the Raiders go into places like the Blue Gate at all. The value of what they can extract from these environments is significant enough to justify the risk, and the risk is genuinely extreme. The Ark units that patrol these zones are not mindless. They have behavioural patterns that suggest something more complex than simple threat response programming. They move in ways that suggest awareness. They react in ways that suggest memory, or something that functions like memory. And somewhere in the background of all of this, visible from certain vantage points, on the Blue Gate map, there is the Emperor. Mountain-sized, moving slowly, present in a way that changes the meaning of everything around it. The human communities that survived the initial invasion are scattered and resource-poor, but they are not without organisation. The lore points toward networks of cooperation between survivor groups, informal economies, and a shared body of knowledge about how to navigate the converted zones. This knowledge is hard-won and not freely given. It represents the accumulated experience of people who learned what the Ark will and will not tolerate, what behaviours attract attention, and what behaviours do not, where the patrol patterns have gaps and where they do not. The people who built this knowledge often did not survive to share it directly. It was extracted from the evidence of their failures, from the wreckage of expeditions that went wrong, from the gear they left behind and the paths they took that ended badly. Understanding the pre-invasion world matters because it helps establish the scale of what was lost. The Ark did not arrive and find nothing worth destroying. They arrived and found a complex functioning human civilization, with all its contradictions and achievements intact. Art, science, architecture, agriculture, medicine, music, philosophy, all of it was in progress when the machines came down. What the survivors carry with them is not just survival instinct, it is the memory of everything that was there before. And that memory is one of the things that makes the human presence in Ark Raiders feel genuinely tragic, in a way that a lot of post-apocalyptic settings do not quite achieve. The grief is specific. The loss is named. The Ark as a faction does not appear to be interested in human beings in any direct ideological sense. They are not conquerors in the human understanding of that word. They are not interested in subjugating human populations or extracting labour or establishing dominance hierarchies. The lore consistently suggests something more alien than that. The Ark appear to be interested in the planet itself, in its physical composition, in its resources at a level that has nothing to do with the humans who happen to be living on it. The invasion reads less like an attack and more like an industrial process. The machines arrived and began doing something to the planet, and the human beings in the way of that process are, at best, an inconvenience to be managed, and at worst simply irrelevant. This reading of the Ark as an industrial force rather than a conquering army changes how you interpret everything about the game world, including the Emperor. If the Ark are engaged in a planetary scale industrial process, then the Emperor is not a general or a warlord. It is something more like a primary piece of industrial equipment, something designed to operate at a scale that no individual human or human weapon was designed to address. The Emperor's size, its slowness, its apparent indifference to the raiders who move around the edges of its operational zone, All of these details make more sense if you think of it not as a combatant, but as a machine doing a very large job. The question that the lore leaves open, and that I think is one of the most interesting questions in Ark Raiders, is what job that is. The name Emperor is worth pausing on. It is a human-assigned designation, not an Ark designation. The Ark do not name their own units in any way that human beings have been able to decode. The name Emperor was given by survivors who observed this particular unit and needed a word for it, and the word they chose is significant. They did not call it the Mountain or the Colossus or the Giant. They called it the Emperor. That choice of name implies something about how human observers perceived it, not just as the largest machine, but as the one that seemed to be in charge of something, the one that other machines oriented themselves around, the one whose presence seemed to organize the behavior of smaller units in its vicinity. Whether that perception is accurate is something the lore leaves open for interpretation. The early days of the invasion, which we can reconstruct only partially from the available evidence, appear to have been defined by a period of overwhelming and one-sided conflict. Human military forces, whatever form they took in this particular version of Earth, were not equipped to deal with the Ark in any meaningful way. The scale and the nature of the machines were simply outside the parameters of anything human military doctrine had prepared for. The evidence suggests that organized resistance collapsed quickly, not because human beings lacked courage, but because the tactical and strategic frameworks that militaries operate within had no useful application against an enemy that did not behave like any previously known enemy. What followed the collapse of organized resistance was a period of adaptation that the lore treats with genuine respect. The human beings who survived were not passive. They were inventive and resilient in ways that suggest the human capacity for adaptation under pressure is itself a meaningful force in the world of Ark Raiders. The Raiders who came after the player characters are the inheritors of that adaptive tradition. They operate with tools and knowledge that were developed specifically to address the reality of the Ark world, not the pre-invasion world. Their gear, their tactics, their understanding of the converted zones, all of it represents a genuine evolution in response to an unprecedented challenge. The converted zones themselves are worth describing in some detail because they form the physical context for everything that happens in the game. These are not simply destroyed areas. They have been transformed according to a logic that is not human logic. The Ark have introduced physical and environmental changes that serve their own purposes, but that also create a landscape unlike anything in pre-invasion experience. Structures that were built by human hands have been incorporated into Ark infrastructure in ways that blur the line between ruin and machine. Materials have been repurposed. The terrain has been altered. And in all of this, there is a consistency that suggests intentional design, a plan being executed at a very large scale by a very large number of machines working in coordination. The Blue Gate map is one of the most visually and narratively rich of these converted zones. The name Blue Gate is itself a piece of lore. Something about this location involves a threshold, a passage point of some kind, and the blue coloration that gives it the name is present in the environmental detail of the Ark modifications to the area. The gate aspect, the threshold aspect, is something that recurs in the lore and that connects directly to the Emperor. The possibility that the Emperor is in some way associated with or even responsible for whatever the Blue Gate is as a functional element of the Ark's planetary scale operation is one of the more compelling readings of the available evidence. Human survivors who have been in the vicinity of the Blue Gate for extended periods report, through whatever fragmentary accounts the lore preserves, a specific quality to the experience that goes beyond the standard dangers of a converted zone. There is something about the presence of the Emperor at the edge of perception, visible in the background, moving slowly but always there, that affects the psychology of anyone who spends time in that environment. This is not a supernatural claim in the context of the game's lore. It is a practical observation about what it does to a human being's sense of scale and safety to have a mountain-sized machine operating in your environment as a background constant. The Emperor is not hunting the raiders who enter the Blue Gate, but it is there, and its being there changes everything. The Ark's smaller units, the ones that raiders actually engage in combat during operations in the converted zones, are striking in their design. The spider-like quality of the Ark robots is not an accident. It is a design language that the developers chose deliberately and that the lore supports as reflecting something real about how these machines were built and for what purpose. The multi-legged body plan of the Ark units is genuinely efficient for the kind of terrain they operate in. The converted zones are not flat or regular. The Ark units need to be able to navigate complex, variable terrain quickly and reliably, and the spider-like body plan serves that purpose well. But there is also something about the aesthetic of these machines that carries meaning beyond pure function. The spider design of the Ark units carries associations that are worth thinking about in the context of the lore. Spiders are builders and hunters. They create structures to catch things in. They are patient, they are numerous, they can be very small, or in certain cases, surprisingly large, and they operate according to a logic that feels alien to human beings, even though they share the same planet. All of these associations map onto the Ark in ways that feel intentional. The Ark build. The Ark are patient. The Ark are numerous. The smaller units feel alien in their behavior, even though they're doing things that can be described in functional terms. And at the apex of this spider-like hierarchy, there is the Emperor, the largest spider of all. The question of where the Ark came from is one that the lore deliberately leaves unresolved. The game does not tell you that the Ark are from a specific star system, or that they were built by a specific alien civilization. What it gives you instead are clues about what they are and what they're doing, without definitively answering the question of origin. This is a smart narrative choice. The mystery of origin is more useful than the answer would be, because the answer would tend to reduce the Ark to something comprehensible and bounded. The mystery keeps them large, it keeps them threatening in the right way, and it keeps the Emperor, as the largest and most mysterious Ark element, genuinely open to interpretation. One of the things the lore consistently suggests is that the Ark are not improvising. Everything about their operation on Earth looks planned. The converted zones are not randomly distributed. The behavior of the Ark units follows consistent patterns that suggest coordination at a level beyond simple programming. The transformation of the physical environment is proceeding in a direction, towards something, even if what that something is remains unclear. And the Emperor, moving slowly through the background of the Blue Gate, is participating in this directed process. It is not wandering. It is going somewhere, or doing something, or maintaining something. The sense that there is a plan behind all of this is one of the most unsettling elements of the Ark Raiders lore. The human communities that have survived and adapted have developed specific cultural responses to the Ark that the lore hints at without fully describing. There are likely myths and stories about the machines among the survivor populations. There are probably rituals around going into the converted zones, ways of managing the psychological weight of operating in environments dominated by alien machines. The raiders who go into the Blue Gate are not robots themselves. They are human beings doing a dangerous job in a world that has been fundamentally altered, and they carry all the emotional and psychological complexity that implies. The Emperor, as a looming background presence, has probably become part of the mythology of the survivor communities, a symbol of something, a point around which fear and meaning coalesce. The physical scale of the Emperor relative to the human scale elements of the Blue Gate map is something that the developers clearly thought hard about. The Emperor is not merely large. It is large in a way that produces a specific visual and psychological effect when you see it in the background. It does not read as something that could ever be fought at the scale of current player operations. It reads as something that exists at a different level of reality than the individual raider moving through the foreground. This gap in scale is itself a piece of lore. It tells you something about where the Emperor sits in the hierarchy of Ark forces. It is not a unit among units, it is something else entirely. The developers of Ark Raiders have consistently telegraphed their ambitions for the Emperor as a future piece of content, while simultaneously being careful about what they confirm. The language used in interviews and developer notes suggests that the Emperor is a centerpiece of their long-term vision for the game, but the specifics of what that means remain deliberately vague. This vagueness is not evasion. It is the appropriate behavior of a development team that wants to preserve the mystery of this element of their world until the right moment. For lore researchers and the player community, this means that what we have to work with is the evidence that is already in the game, and that evidence is rich enough to support a very detailed and genuinely interesting interpretation. The Raider's relationship with the ARC is defined primarily by avoidance rather than confrontation. The standard operating approach for a successful Raider is to move through the converted zones without triggering the sustained attention of the ARC units that patrol those zones. This is not cowardice. It is a rational response to the reality of what a Raider is versus what an ARC unit is. The machines are stronger, faster in specific contexts, and more numerous than any individual or small group of Raiders can overcome through direct force. The smart play is always the evasive play, but the lore also suggests that this approach has limits, and that the growing pressure of survival is pushing the Raiders toward more direct engagement with ARC forces over time. The ecology of the converted zones is one of the more subtle pieces of lore in ARC Raiders. The ARC have not simply installed machines in these environments and left everything else unchanged. The environments themselves have been altered in ways that affect the non-ARC elements within them. The plants, if there are any, the animals, if any remain, the air quality, the water, the soil chemistry, all of these things appear to have been changed as a byproduct of whatever the ARC are doing, and these changes create a specific kind of danger for human beings operating in these zones that goes beyond the direct threat of the ARC units themselves. The Blue Gate is not just patrolled by machines, it is itself, in some sense, a machine environment optimized for machine purposes rather than human ones. The weight of this environmental transformation is something that Raiders have to account for in their operations. Equipment needs to be adapted to function in conditions that differ from standard human environments. Physical tolerances need to be managed. Time in the converted zones is not simply a matter of avoiding ARC units. It is a matter of managing all the ways in which the environment itself is working against human presence. This creates a compelling gameplay loop, but also a compelling narrative framework. The Raiders are operating in territory that was never designed for them, using tools that were designed for a world that no longer fully exists, in service of communities whose survival depends on what they can bring back from these hostile places. The connection between the smaller ARC units and the Emperor is something the lore hints at without spelling out. The spider-like patrol units that Raiders engage in the Blue Gate share a design language with the Emperor that suggests a common origin or a common design philosophy. They are not different species of machine, they are different scales of the same thing. The Emperor's body plan, as much as we can reconstruct it from the available visual evidence in the game, extends the spider-like aesthetic of the smaller units to a dimension where the individual components of its structure are themselves the size of buildings. The legs of the Emperor are not like the legs of the smaller units. They are not legs in the same functional sense. They are structural elements that move. The scale changes the meaning. The communities that send Raiders into converted zones like the Blue Gate are operating on the edge of a calculation that is constantly shifting. The value of what can be extracted from these environments needs to justify the losses that extraction operations inevitably produce. And the calculation becomes harder when the Emperor is factored in, not because it directly attacks raiders in their current operations, but because its presence in the Blue Gate environment changes the risk profile of that zone in ways that are difficult to quantify. The Emperor represents a category of threat that the current tools of raider operations were not designed to address. It exists outside the normal risk calculus, and its slow movement toward whatever it is moving toward means that the Blue Gate as a resource environment may not be available indefinitely. There is a temporal dimension to the Emperor's presence that the law suggests but does not directly state. The Emperor is moving, slowly but moving. It has a direction, and that direction, extrapolated forward, points towards something that the available law frames as significant. This is not simply a background detail about a large machine being in the area, it is a narrative statement about change. The Emperor's movement implies that the current state of the Blue Gate, the current relationship between raiders and this particular converted zone, is temporary. The Emperor's arrival, at whatever destination it is approaching, will change things. The law points toward this without specifying when it will happen or what exactly will change, but the direction of travel is itself a piece of information. The way the developers have integrated the Emperor into the visual design of the Blue Gate map is worth dwelling on. It is always visible from certain vantage points, always in the background, always moving with that slow patience that makes it more unsettling than a fast threat would be. A fast threat triggers adrenaline and the focused response of fight or flight. A slow, massive, distant threat triggers something different, a sustained low-grade awareness of scale and vulnerability that does not resolve into a clear fight or flight response. It just sits there in your peripheral awareness, changing the quality of everything you're doing in the foreground. The developers clearly understood this psychology when they placed the Emperor where they did. The raiders who operate in the Blue Gate have given the Emperor a name, but that naming is itself a kind of coping mechanism. Naming something is a way of making it manageable, of giving it a place in a cognitive framework that can be dealt with. The Emperor is a name that acknowledges what the raiders perceive as its status in the ARC hierarchy, but it is also a name that contains the threat within a linguistic box. By calling it the Emperor, the survivors are doing what human beings have always done with things that are too large to directly confront. They are giving it a place in a story that has human beings in it, that has relationships and hierarchies and categories that human minds can navigate. The Emperor, as a word, is a human imposition on something that probably does not organize itself around human concepts of power or authority. The physical evidence in the Blue Gate map for the Emperor's prior activity in the area, if any, is something that law researchers have speculated about extensively. Does the Emperor pass through areas repeatedly, leaving traces? Are there marks on the landscape that correspond to the Emperor's passage? The scale of the Emperor would make its ground contact leave marks that should be visible and interpretable by raiders who knew what to look for. Whether any of the environmental features of the Blue Gate map represent this kind of trace is an open question, but it is one that the law community has engaged with seriously, and the answers that some researchers have proposed are genuinely interesting in the way they connect the Emperor to the physical history of the environment. The question of whether the Emperor is aware of the raiders who operate in its general vicinity is one that the law touches on without resolving. The Emperor does not appear to directly respond to raider activity in the Blue Gate in its current behaviour, but the category of awareness that the Emperor might be capable of is probably not comparable to the awareness of the smaller patrol units. A machine of the Emperor's scale and apparent complexity might have an entirely different relationship to information about its environment. It might perceive the world at a different resolution than the smaller units, attending to things of a correspondingly large scale, while smaller things, including individual raiders, simply fall below its threshold of relevant input. This would be consistent with the observation that the Emperor does not directly attack raiders in current operations. The history of human exploration of the Blue Gate Zone, which the lore fragments allow us to partially reconstruct, is a history of escalating ambition and escalating danger. The earliest raiders who entered the Blue Gate were operating with very limited information about what was there and how it worked. They were essentially scouts, gathering the foundational knowledge that later operations would be built on. Many of them did not survive to share what they found, but the knowledge accumulated anyway, through the evidence they left behind, and through the occasional survivor who made it back with something worth knowing. Over time, the Blue Gate became one of the more understood converted zones, even as the Emperor's presence in its background remained one of the least understood elements of any zone in the game. Chapter 2. The Architecture of the ARC. The physical design of the ARC units, from the smallest patrol bot to the Emperor itself, is one of the most carefully developed aspects of ARC Raiders lore, and it repays close attention. The spider-like body plan that defines the ARC aesthetic is not simply a visual choice made for variety. It reflects something real about how these machines were designed to operate, and it carries implications for how they should be understood as a kind of intelligence and a kind of force. The multi-legged body plan is, in mechanical terms, extremely good at navigating complex terrain. It distributes weight effectively. It maintains stability when individual limbs encounter obstacles. It allows for precise, deliberate movement through environments that would challenge wheeled or tracked alternatives. The ARC chose this design for a reason. When you watch the smaller ARC units move through the converted zones of ARC raiders, there is something in the movement that goes beyond mechanical efficiency. The way they carry themselves, the way they respond to their environment, the specific quality of the attention they seem to pay to their surroundings. All of this suggests a behavioural complexity that is not captured by simply describing them as robots following patrol routes. They behave as if they are interested in their environment in some active sense. They behave as if information matters to them beyond its immediate tactical application. This is unusual for machines of their apparent purpose, and it suggests that the ARC's design philosophy prioritizes something like environmental intelligence in a way that most human-designed machines do not. The materials that the ARC use in their construction are distinct from human industrial materials in ways that the lore points toward without fully analyzing. The surfaces of ARC units have a quality that human-made metals and polymers do not replicate. The way they interact with light, the way they respond to damage, the way they weather environmental conditions over time, all of these things suggest material science that operates on principles that human engineering had not reached at the time of the invasion. This is consistent with the reading of the ARC as a technologically advanced civilization or system, but it also raises questions about how those materials are sourced and processed. If the ARC arrived with sufficient quantity of their construction materials to build the infrastructure visible in the converted zones, then the logistical scale of the invasion is even more staggering than the combat scale suggests. The converted zones, as noted earlier, are environments that have been physically altered by ARC activity. But one of the things that close examination of those alterations suggests is that the ARC are not simply installing their own structures in place of human ones. They appear to be, in some cases, incorporating human-made structures into their own infrastructure. This is not repurposing in the human sense, where a building designed for one use is adapted for another use. It is something more integrated than that. Human architectural elements appear to become part of ARC structures in a way that blurs the boundary between the original human design and the ARC addition. The lore suggests this is intentional, that the ARC are using the physical material of human construction as a component in their own work. This incorporation of human-made materials into ARC structures is a detail that carries significant narrative weight. It means that the ARC invasion is not simply a replacement of one civilization's infrastructure with another's. It is a transformation where the material substance of human civilization becomes part of the material substance of the ARC's work on the planet. The cities that were destroyed are not simply gone, they have been absorbed. Their physical substance continues to exist in a new form, serving a new purpose in the architecture of the converted zones. This is a disturbing reading, but it is one that the available evidence supports, and it changes the meaning of the loss that the survivors experienced. They did not simply lose their cities were taken and made into something else. The scale progression visible in the ARC unit designs is meaningful as a piece of lore. The smallest ARC units that raiders encounter in the converted zones are roughly human scale or slightly larger. The medium units are vehicle scale, the larger units are building scale, and the Emperor is in a category beyond all of these, mountain scale, operating at a size where the categories that apply to the smaller units simply do not translate. This progression is not random. It suggests a design philosophy that scales function with size, that different categories of ARC work require different categories of ARC equipment, and that the Emperor represents the largest category of work. The question is what category of work that is. The behavioral differences between ARC units of different sizes are significant enough to constitute qualitative rather than just quantitative differences. The smallest ARC units behave in ways that can be described in fairly straightforward tactical terms. They patrol, they respond to detected threats, they communicate information to other units. Their behavior is complex but interpretable. The medium and larger units exhibit behavior that is progressively harder to interpret through a simple threat response framework. They appear to be doing things that are not directly related to immediate security functions. They appear to be engaged in constructive or processual activities that have their own logic, separate from the logic of defending territory or engaging threats. And the Emperor, at the far end of this scale, appears to be doing something that is so large in scale that its individual movements carry no obvious tactical meaning at all. The internal structure of the ARC units is something that the lore touches on through the items and materials that raiders can extract from destroyed ARC components. The internal composition of these machines is not analogous to any human engineering tradition. The components are integrated in ways that resist the kind of modular analysis that human engineers would apply to their own machines. The parts do not obviously map to functions in the way that human-made machines do. There is an organic quality to the internal architecture of the ARC units that is consistent with the spider-like external aesthetic, as if the designers of these machines took biological principles of integration and applied them to machine construction. This is a significant hint about the nature of the ARC, whether they are themselves biological in origin, whether they were designed by biological beings who drew on biological principles, or whether they represent a convergent approach to machine design that arrived at similar solutions to similar problems by a different path. The communication between ARC units is one of the more speculative areas of the lore, but it is an area where the available evidence strongly suggests something more sophisticated than simple radio communication or command and control signals. The way ARC units respond to each other's behavior, the way coordinated responses seem to emerge without obvious individual units serving as commanders, the way information about raider activity seems to propagate through ARC units in an area, all of this is consistent with a distributed intelligence model rather than a hierarchical command model. The ARC units are not soldiers following orders from commanders. They are nodes in a network that collectively computes responses to situations. And if that is accurate, then the Emperor's position in that network is not necessarily that of a commander either. It may be something different. The Emperor's design, as seen from the available visual information in the game, extends the spider-like aesthetic of the smaller units to a dimension where new functional elements become necessary. At mountain scale, the body plan that serves the smaller units as a basis for agile terrain navigation transforms into something more like a platform, a stable base from which other activities can be conducted. The legs of the Emperor are not being used to navigate terrain in the way that the smaller units' legs are. They are being used to move the Emperor's enormous body slowly and deliberately across the landscape, with each step representing a commitment of mass and energy that no quick maneuvering can follow. The Emperor does not move the way the small units move. It moves the way a glacier moves, with the same kind of patient, inexorable progress toward a destination. The visual language of the Emperor's design, as visible in the game, includes elements that the smaller units do not have. At sufficient scale, what were structural elements in the smaller units become architectural spaces in the Emperor. Things that function as joints in a smaller machine become openings large enough to contain entire environments in a larger one. The Emperor is not just a scaled-up version of the smaller ARC units. It is a qualitatively different kind of structure that happens to share the same fundamental design language. And the elements of its design that differ from the smaller units are probably the most informative parts of the lore, because they point toward what the Emperor is, for that the smaller units are not for. The ARC's relationship to energy is something that the lore raises without fully explaining. The machines clearly require energy to operate, and the conversion of the physical environment that they have undertaken includes elements that look like energy collection infrastructure. The blue elements that give the Blue Gate its name are consistent with energy-related functionality in the ARC's design language. This suggests that what the ARC are doing on Earth includes a significant energy harvesting component, that the converted zones are not just occupied territory, but are active production sites for whatever the ARC need energy for. And at the scale at which the Emperor operates, the energy requirements would be correspondingly enormous. The Emperor is not drawing its power from a battery, it is drawing its power from something at a planetary scale. The relationship between the ARC's design and the natural world is an area where the lore offers some of its most interesting hints. The ARC units are not designed to be indifferent to the natural environment. They interact with it in specific ways that suggest it has functional value for them. The spider-like body plan that characterizes the ARC aesthetic is not just a metaphorical echo of biological design. It may reflect a genuine relationship between the ARC's operational approach and the biological principles they have studied, absorbed, or derived independently. If the ARC units are designed with reference to biological templates, then the Emperor, as the largest and most complex ARC unit, may be the fullest expression of that biological reference in mechanical form. It may be in some sense the most biomimetic machine ever built. The smaller ARC units that raiders encounter in the converted zones exhibit a territorial behavior that is consistent with biological territorial behavior in some ways, but distinctly different in others. They do not defend a specific geographic area in the way that a biological territorial animal would. They maintain a kind of operational domain that shifts with their patrol routes and their activity patterns. But they do respond to incursions into their operational domain with an escalating intensity that feels territorial in the biological sense. The ARC units seem to care about being observed in certain activities. They respond to proximity during what appears to be constructive or maintenance work with more aggression than they do to proximity during patrol activity. This suggests that what they are doing matters to them in some functional sense, even if we cannot fully decode what that function is. The Emperor's operational domain in the Blue Gate is interesting to think about in light of this territorial behavior. The Emperor's sheer size means that its operational domain, if defined by the same parameters that define the smaller unit's domains, would encompass a vast area. The Blue Gate as a zone may fall entirely within what the Emperor considers its operational space, and if that is true, then the raiders who enter the Blue Gate are not operating in a zone that is merely proximate to the Emperor. They are operating within it. The Emperor's lack of direct response to raider activity might not be indifference to their presence. It might be a calculated decision to tolerate a level of activity that falls below some threshold of meaningful interference with the Emperor's actual work. The materials that the ARC extract from the converted Earth are a crucial piece of the law that connects the smaller scale activity of the ARC units to the larger scale work that the Emperor appears to be engaged in. The ARC units are not simply occupying the converted zones, they are processing them. The transformation of the physical environment is extractive as well as constructive, taking specific materials from the existing terrain and the existing human-made structures and incorporating them into ARC systems. This extraction and incorporation is happening at every scale of ART activity. The smallest units carry materials. The medium units process them. The largest units below the Emperor appear to engage in primary extraction at a geological scale, and the Emperor, above all of these, is presumably engaged in whatever comes next in that process chain. The visual evidence in the Blue Gate for active ARC processing of the environment is extensive. The landscape has not just been damaged or occupied, it has been worked. The marks of ARC activity in the terrain have the quality of industrial marks, of large machinery engaged in systematic extraction and transformation of the underlying geological material. This is not the random destruction of a military operation. It is the organized extraction of a mining or processing operation, and the scale of that operation, visible in the physical evidence of the Blue Gate, is consistent with the Emperor's presence being a primary driver of it. The Emperor is not watching what is being done in the Blue Gate. There is a real possibility that the Emperor is what is doing it. The hierarchy of ARC forces visible in the converted zones suggests a division of labour that is quite sophisticated. Different categories of ARC unit appear to specialise in different aspects of the overall operation. Some units are clearly security-focused, maintaining the patrols and threat response functions. Others appear to be focused on constructive work, building or extending ARC infrastructure. Others still appear to be engaged in extractive work, processing the physical environment. The Emperor sits above all of these specializations. Its size and apparent complexity suggest that it does not fall into any of the functional categories that apply to the smaller units. It represents something else in the hierarchy, something that the available law does not fully define, but that clearly has a different kind of role. The weapons or offensive capabilities of the Emperor, if any, are something that the law community has speculated about extensively. A machine of the Emperor's size could be presumed to carry defensive or offensive systems that are correspondingly scaled. But in the current version of the game, the Emperor has not been observed using any weapons against raiders or anything else. This absence of observed offensive behaviour does not mean the Emperor lacks offensive capability. It likely means that nothing in the current operational environment of the Blue Gate has triggered whatever the Emperor's threat response protocols are. The threshold for the Emperor to engage in offensive behaviour is presumably very different from the threshold for the smaller units. The Emperor operates at a scale where the threats that concern it are correspondingly large. The ARC's construction of infrastructure in the converted zones follows patterns that are consistent across different locations in the game world. The design language is consistent. The materials are consistent. The functional organization is consistent. This suggests a unified design doctrine, a single set of principles that govern all ARC construction activity regardless of location or scale. And the Emperor's movement through the Blue Gate is presumably consistent with this doctrine as well. The Emperor is not improvising. It is following a plan that was established before it arrived in the Blue Gate, a plan that is part of the same unified doctrine that governs all ARC activity on Earth. Understanding the doctrine would mean understanding the Emperor. The doctrine is the mystery. The human capacity to damage ARC units, while limited compared to the full capability of ARC forces, is a real factor in the operational environment of the converted zones. Raiders can and do destroy ARC units in their operations. This is not merely a gameplay mechanic, it is a narrative statement about the relationship between human technology and ARC technology. The gap is large, but it is not absolute. Human ingenuity and ARC-derived technology have given the Raiders tools that can effectively engage the smaller and medium ARC units. The larger units require more resources and more coordination to deal with effectively. And the Emperor, at its current scale, appears to be outside the envelope of what current Raider capability can address. This is a gap that the law suggests will eventually need to close. The sensory capabilities of the ARC units are an area where the law gives us some useful information. The smaller units clearly have visual and acoustic sensory systems that allow them to detect raiders in standard conditions. They also appear to have additional sensory capabilities that detect things like heat signatures or movement patterns in ways that go beyond standard optical and acoustic detection. The medium and larger units appear to have more sophisticated sensory systems that operate over longer ranges and detect subtler signatures. The Emperor, at its scale and apparent complexity, would presumably have sensory systems operating at a correspondingly large scale, perceiving things at a range and resolution that smaller units cannot access. What the Emperor perceives and how it processes that information are questions that remain open in the law. The question of whether the Emperor is a unique unit or one of a class of similar units is one that the law raises without definitively answering. In the Blue Gate, it is the only unit of its kind visible, but the existence of one unit of Emperor scale does not mean it is the only one of its kind. The ARC's operation on Earth is global in scope. If the Emperor represents a category of ARC equipment required for the primary stage of the ARC's planetary scale process, then there may be other Emperors in other locations, each engaged in the same kind of large-scale work at different points on the planet. The law does not confirm or deny this, but the possibility adds another dimension to the question of what the Emperor is and what it is doing. The relationship between the Emperor and the ARC's overall strategic goals on Earth is the question that all the other questions point toward. The ARC came to Earth to do something: the conversion of the physical environment, the extraction of materials, the construction of infrastructure, the deployment of an enormous variety of machine types at all scales of operation. All of this is in service of something. The Emperor, as the largest and most resource-intensive element of the ARC presence on Earth, is presumably central to whatever that something is. It is not a sideshow. It is not a defensive measure. It is a primary actor in the main event of the ARC's purpose on Earth. And the main event is what the law is ultimately about. The survivors who have developed the deepest understanding of the ARC over the years since the invasion are few in number and not always willing to share what they know. The raiders who have survived the most operations in the most dangerous converted zones carry an understanding of the ARC that goes beyond tactical knowledge. They have seen things that most people have not. They have been in places that most raiders do not survive to return from. And some of them have been in visual proximity to the Emperor in a way that few have been. What they have observed and what they have concluded from those observations is a piece of law that the game treats with appropriate gravity, a knowledge that is hard to come by and that carries weight precisely because of what it costs to obtain. The ARC's apparent disinterest in establishing communication with human beings is one of the more troubling aspects of their presence on Earth. Many post-invasion scenarios in science fiction involve at least the attempt at communication between the invading force and the invaded civilization. The ARC, as represented in the law of ARC raiders, do not appear to have made any such attempt. They arrived, They began their process. The humans in the way were dealt with as obstacles rather than as entities worth communicating with. This is not necessarily because the ARC are hostile to intelligence or consciousness in principle. It may be because human beings, on the scale at which the ARC operate, are simply not relevant to the conversation. The Emperor does not speak to raiders. It does not need to. They are not interlocutors at its scale. The long-term trajectory of the ARC's work on Earth, as suggested by the current state of the converted zones and the direction of the Emperor's movement, points toward a transformation that will eventually make Earth unrecognizable in human terms. The current converted zones are not end states. They are intermediate stages in a process that is still ongoing. The blue gate is being worked, the physical environment is being changed, and the Emperor is moving towards something that represents the next stage of that change. Whether human civilization has any realistic prospect of surviving to see what that next stage looks like, or whether the Raiders' operations in zones like the Blue Gate are just footnotes to a process that will eventually render the planet uninhabitable for biological life, is a question that the lore frames as genuinely open. The answer is not predetermined in this narrative. The human response to the ARC matters. What the Raiders do in the converted zones matters. The outcome is not fixed. The aesthetic of the ARC world, as represented in the converted zones of ARC Raiders, is genuinely distinctive and worth appreciating as a piece of creative work. The developers at Embark Studios found a visual language for alien industrial occupation that is different from the standard science fiction vocabulary for this kind of scenario. It does not look like the alien environments of most science fiction games. The ARC's modifications to the Earth environment have a specific quality that is simultaneously mechanical and almost organic, as if the machines are growing rather than building. The blue energy signatures that permeate the converted zones have a visual character that is simultaneously beautiful and deeply wrong, producing an aesthetic that is unsettling in a sophisticated way. The Emperor, as the largest expression of this aesthetic, carries all of these qualities at a scale where they become overwhelming. The narrative potential of the Emperor as a future content element in ARC Raiders is enormous, and the lore architecture that has been built around it reflects that. The developers have not built a mountain-sized machine into their game world and placed it in a prominent background position for no reason. It is there because it is important. It is there because it will eventually be relevant in a way that it is not yet relevant in the current version of the game. The question of when and how that relevance will manifest is one of the most anticipated questions in the ARC Raiders community. The evidence in the current lore suggests that the Emperor's role in the game's narrative is not just that of a boss fight. It is something with a deeper connection to what the ARC are doing on Earth and what the human response to that will ultimately be. The choice to place the Emperor in the background of the Blue Gate, rather than in the direct operational zone of current Raider activity, is a deliberate and smart narrative decision. It creates a constant awareness of the Emperor without making it an immediate threat. It establishes the Emperor as a piece of the world's reality before it becomes a piece of active gameplay. When the Emperor eventually becomes directly relevant to Raider operations, whether as a raid target or as a narrative event or as something else entirely, the players who have been operating in the Blue Gate will have a relationship with it already. They will have seen it. They will have felt its presence. The shift from background presence to foreground threat will carry emotional weight because the setup has been done correctly. The physical architecture of the Blue Gate map, with its specific arrangement of structures and terrain features, may reflect the Emperor's prior activity in the area in ways that close examination can reveal. The landscape was not shaped by random ARC activity. The specific configuration of the Blue Gate suggests that it was shaped by a specific operational need, a need that the Emperor was involved in meeting. The structures that have been built there, The modifications to the terrain, the energy infrastructure visible in the blue signatures throughout the zone, all of these are the residue of a purpose. And the Emperor's continued presence in the area, moving slowly through the background, suggests that the purpose is not finished. The blue gate is a work in progress, and the Emperor is the primary worker. The raiders' understanding of what they're doing when they enter the blue gate is worth examining in light of all this. They believe they are scavenging materials from a converted zone, extracting value from an environment that the ARC have taken, but that the raiders can still access. But the law suggests that this understanding may be incomplete. If the blue gate is an active industrial site, if the Emperor is engaged in a primary stage geological process there, then the materials the raiders are extracting may have a significance in the ARC's process that the raiders do not fully appreciate. They may not just be scavenging, they may be interfering, and the degree to which that interference matters to the ARC, and specifically to the Emperor, is a question that the law leaves open in a way that has real narrative tension. The technical vocabulary of the raiders, as heard in the game's environmental audio and character dialogue, reveals something about how the survivors of the ARC invasion have adapted their cognitive frameworks to the new reality. They have developed terminology for ARC phenomena that did not exist before the invasion. They have classification systems for ARC unit types. They have operational protocols for different risk levels in the converted zones. This vocabulary reflects an impressive amount of practical knowledge accumulated under extremely difficult conditions, but it also reflects the limits of that knowledge. The raiders have good practical frameworks for the things they encounter regularly. They have much less framework for things they encounter rarely or not at all. The Emperor falls in the latter category. The vocabulary for the Emperor is less developed because the experience of it is less developed. It is the thing at the edge of what is known. The relationship between the Emperor and the concept of a late-game boss in the design philosophy of ARC raiders is something that deserves careful treatment. The term boss in game design usually implies a singular combat encounter, designed around specific player capabilities and designed to test specific skills. The Emperor is probably not a boss in that relatively simple sense. The scale of the Emperor, combined with what the law suggests about its role in the ARC's operation, implies something more involved than a combat encounter at the end of a progression path. If the Emperor is ever directly engaged by raiders in a designed encounter, that encounter will probably need to make sense in terms of the game's narrative as well as its gameplay. The lore architecture that has been built around the Emperor is too rich to be sacrificed in service of a simple boss fight. It will need to be respected. The community of players engaged with ARC Raiders lore have produced an impressive body of interpretation and analysis around the Emperor in particular. The fact that it is visible, but untouchable, present but not directly engaged, has made it one of the more productive objects of fan theorizing in the game. The theories range from the straightforward to the genuinely sophisticated, and some of the better ones have produced interpretations of the Emperor's role and purpose that are internally consistent with the available evidence, and that go beyond what any individual element of the lore explicitly states. This community analysis is itself a piece of the Emperor's story. The human response to the incomprehensible, the drive to understand it by building models and testing them against evidence, is one of the themes that the Emperor embodies most completely. The Emperor's movement, slow as it is, represents a kind of statement. It is not static. It is not parked or anchored or installed. It moves. And movement implies purpose in a way that a stationary object does not. A stationary machine might be doing its work in place. A moving machine is going somewhere. And the Emperor's destination, wherever it is part of the story. The lore does not tell us what is at the end of the Emperor's path. But the fact that there is a path, that the Emperor has a direction and is following it, is one of the most important pieces of information the available evidence gives us. It means the Emperor is not finished. It is in the middle of something, and the middle of something always implies a beginning and an end. The beginning of the Emperor's specific engagement with the Blue Gate as a piece of narrative history is something the lore does not directly address. When did the Emperor arrive in the area? Was it there from the beginning of the invasion? Did it move into the area as part of a later phase of the ARC's work? The answer to these questions would tell us a lot about where in the overall ARC process the Blue Gate currently is. If the Emperor has been in the Blue Gate since the early days of the invasion, that would suggest the area is in a relatively advanced stage of ARC processing. If the Emperor arrived more recently, the Blue Gate might be in an earlier stage, with the Emperor's arrival marking the beginning of a new and more intensive phase of work. The lore does not resolve this, but the physical evidence in the zone could potentially answer it for a careful enough observer. The end of the Emperor's engagement with the Blue Gate as a narrative prospect is what the community most wants to know about. What happens when the Emperor finishes whatever it is doing there? Where does it go? What does the Blue Gate look like after the Emperor has completed its work? These are questions that sit at the forward edge of the lore, in the space between what exists now and what the developers are building toward. The answers are presumably already planned. The developers built the Emperor with intent. They know what it is for, and they know what comes next. The community's engagement with these questions is essentially a dialogue with a secret that is already written, waiting to be revealed. Chapter 3. The Blue Gate and the Threshold of Understanding. The Blue Gate is not just a map. In the context of ARC Raiders lore, it functions as a narrative device as much as a physical location. Something about this specific place was significant enough to the ARC to make it the site of one of their most intensive operations. The name itself, given by human survivors, points towards something threshold-related. A gate is a boundary between two states. It is a point of passage where the nature of what comes through is transformed from one thing into another. Whatever the Blue Gate is a gate to or a gate from, it represents a qualitative boundary in the ARC's work on Earth. And the Emperor's presence in its environs is not incidental. The Emperor is there because of what the gate is. The blue coloration that defines the Blue Gate's visual character is one of the most consistent elements of the ARC aesthetic in this location. Blue energy signatures appear throughout the converted zones of ARC Raiders, but their concentration and intensity in the Blue Gate map is notably higher than in other locations. This concentration suggests that the Blue Gate is a site of particularly intensive ARC energy activity. Whether the energy is being generated here, collected here, transmitted here, or used here for a process that requires high energy density. The specific shade of blue, the quality of the light it produces, the way it interacts with the physical environment around it, all of these are details that carry lore weight even if their precise meaning has not been decoded. The threshold concept, embedded in the gate name, is worth exploring in multiple directions. A gate can be a barrier, something that prevents passage. It can be a valve, something that controls passage. It can be a portal, something that transforms what passes through it. The Blue Gate may be any of these or some combination. In the context of the ARC's planetary-scale industrial process, a gate of any of these types would serve a specific functional purpose. A barrier would protect a particularly important site from interference. A valve would control the flow of materials or energy through a critical junction. A portal would be a site of transformation, where one thing becomes another. The Emperor's presence suggests that whatever the gate does, it requires equipment of the Emperor's scale to maintain or operate. The human experience of the Blue Gate, as reflected in the lore fragments and environmental storytelling available in the game, has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the experience of other converted zones. People who have spent time in the Blue Gate describe it, through whatever accounts the lore preserves, as a place where the strangeness of the ARC presence is felt most acutely. It is not simply more dangerous than other zones. It is more present. The ARC's work there is more intensive, more visible, more palpable as a physical reality. The converted zone quality that affects all the areas the ARC have processed is heightened in the Blue Gate to a degree that has a specific effect on the people who enter it. The environment does something to human perception there that it does not do as intensely elsewhere. The raiders who operate regularly in the Blue Gate develop a specific relationship with its environment over time. Those who survive enough operations there report changes in how they perceive the zone, a developing familiarity with its peculiarities that goes beyond simple tactical knowledge. They learn which areas have the most intense blue signatures. They learn where the ARC activity is most concentrated and where it has relatively lower density. They learn the rhythms of the zone, the patterns in how the ARC units move, and where they gather and what they do in specific parts of the environment. And they learn to live with the Emperor in the background, to incorporate its presence into their operational awareness without letting it occupy all of their attention. This learned relationship with the Blue Gate is a piece of what makes the most experienced raiders distinct. The architectural features of the Blue Gate map that appear to be ARC construction rather than modified human construction are concentrated in specific areas of the zone. These ARC-built structures have a quality that the modified human structures do not share. They were designed from the beginning to serve ARC purposes rather than being adapted from human purposes, and that origin is visible in their form. The ARC architectural principles visible in these structures are consistent with what is visible in the ARC units themselves. The same design language, the same material aesthetic, the same integration of what might be called organic and mechanical elements. And in the most intensively modified parts of the Blue Gate, the boundary between ARC unit and ARC structure becomes ambiguous. The structures have an almost animate quality. They seem responsive in some way to the environment around them. The Emperor's relationship to the ARC-built structures in the Blue Gate is something the lore points toward without fully mapping. Are some of these structures connected to the Emperor's function in a direct way? Are they products of the Emperor's activity, built by smaller units in service of a process the Emperor is directing? Or are they separate elements of the same overall ARC system that the Emperor participates in rather than directs? The available evidence does not resolve this clearly, but it leans toward a model where the Emperor and the Blue Gate infrastructure are part of the same operational system, not independent elements that happen to occupy the same area. The resources that raiders extract from the Blue Gate have qualities that resources from other zones do not have. The influence of the intensive ARC activity in the Blue Gate on the physical properties of the materials there has produced variants of standard materials with enhanced or altered properties. Some of these materials are particularly valuable to the survivor communities precisely because their ARC-influenced qualities make them useful for things that standard materials are not. This creates a specific economic incentive for raider operations in the Blue Gate that goes beyond what can be obtained from less intensively processed zones. The Blue Gate is not just a dangerous place, it is a productive place, and its productivity is a direct result of the intensity of the ARC's work there. The risk-reward calculation for the Blue Gate from the perspective of a raider is therefore complex. The zone is more dangerous than most. The ARC activity is more intense. The Emperor is present in the background, but the quality of what can be extracted from the zone is correspondingly higher. This creates a pressure toward engagement with the Blue Gate that is in tension with the rational caution that survival in the ARC world generally demands. The raiders who are drawn to the Blue Gate are not simply reckless. They are making a calculated bet that the value of what they can extract justifies the elevated risk, and the best of them have developed the skills and knowledge to make that bet pay off more often than not. The seasonal or cyclical dimension of the Blue Gate's ARC activity if any exists, is something that the law touches on only tangentially. Does the intensity of ARC operations in the Blue Gate vary over time? Are there periods when the zone is more actively worked and periods when it is relatively quiet? The Emperor's movement pattern, if it includes regular returns to certain positions or regular periods of reduced activity, could create a cyclical quality to the Blue Gate's operational environment that experienced raiders could learn to exploit. The law does not confirm that such cycles exist, but the general principle that large machines engaged in complex tasks often have operational rhythms is consistent with what we know about the ARC's design philosophy. The Blue Gate's position in the larger geography of the ARC invasion on Earth is not fully established in the available lore. What region is it in? What was there before? What is the relationship between the Blue Gate's location and the geographic priorities of the ARC's overall operation? These contextual questions matter because they could help establish why the Blue Gate is a gate, what it is the gate to, and why the Emperor is there rather than somewhere else. The partial answers that can be constructed from the environmental evidence suggest that the Blue Gate is located at a geographically significant point, a place where the underlying geology has properties that the ARC found worth exploiting at this level of intensity. The Emperor is there because the ground under the Blue Gate has something the Emperor needs. The geological significance of the Blue Gate's location is one of the more interesting speculative areas in the lore research community. The ARC's work in the converted zones is not geologically random. They appear to be targeting specific geological formations, specific concentrations of specific materials, specific geological features that have properties relevant to whatever they are trying to do. The Blue Gate sits on something that matters to the ARC, and at the scale of the Emperor's operations, what it sits on is probably something at a significant geological depth, something that required an Emperor-scale machine to access. The surface-level converted zone that raiders operate in may be just the visible portion of a much deeper operation. The depth of the ARC's work at the Blue Gate, if the geological speculation is accurate, would explain several features of the zone that are otherwise difficult to account for. The intensity of the blue energy signatures might reflect energy being brought up from depth. The specific character of the structural modifications to the terrain might reflect the management of forces from below. And the Emperor's movement, slow as it is, might be the visible component of a process whose primary activity is happening underground. The Emperor on the surface may be managing something below the surface, maintaining access to a geological resource that requires continuous active management to exploit. This reading of the Emperor as a surface manifestation of a much deeper operation is consistent with several elements of the available evidence. The underground dimension of ARC activity in general is underexplored in the lore, partly because it is not directly accessible to raiders in current gameplay. But the surface evidence in the converted zones consistently suggests that the ARC's work extends below the surface in significant ways. The ground in many converted zones shows signs of subsurface activity. The patterns of terrain modification are consistent with large-scale underground operations that have surface effects. And in the Blue Gate, these surface signs of subsurface activity are more pronounced than in other zones. Whatever is happening underground at the Blue Gate is happening on a large scale and with considerable energy. The Emperor's presence suggests it is involved. The lore's treatment of the Blue Gate as a named location, as a place with a specific identity distinct from just any converted zone, is significant. Not all converted zones have names. Some are simply described by their geography or by what can be found there. The Blue Gate has a name that describes what it is rather than where it is or what it contains. That naming reflects an understanding, perhaps imperfect, that this place functions as something. It is a gate. The survivors who named it perceived it as a threshold. They may not have known exactly what kind of threshold it is, but they recognized that something different happens there. that the quality of the ARC's presence there is qualitatively different from other converted zones in a way that the gate concept best captures. The concept of a gate in the context of the ARC's planetary scale industrial process could refer to several different things. It could be a gateway for materials being extracted from the Earth and processed for ARC use. It could be a gate in the sense of a valve regulating the flow of energy through a large-scale ARC energy system. It could be a gate in a more literal sense, a point of access between the surface environment and an underground or otherwise inaccessible ARC facility. Or it could be a gate in a more abstract sense, a critical threshold in the ARC's overall process on Earth, a point that needs to be passed before the process can move to the next stage. The Emperor's association with the Blue Gate suggests it is involved in whatever kind of gate this is. The history of human knowledge about the Blue Gate, as it can be reconstructed from the lore, is a history of progressive and hard-won understanding. The earliest survivors who named the area did not understand what they were naming beyond the visual impression. The raiders who followed learned more through experience. The lore researchers who have studied the available evidence have built frameworks that go beyond what any individual raider's experience could produce, but even the most sophisticated current understanding of the Blue Gate is probably incomplete in important ways. The information that is not missing randomly. It is missing in ways that suggest specific aspects of the Blue Gate's function are still hidden from the available evidence. The most important question, what is the Blue Gate a gate to, remains genuinely open. The emotional texture of the Blue Gate as a place, as experienced by raiders who operate there, is something the lore builds through environmental detail rather than through direct description. The sounds of the zone have a specific character. The visual environment has a quality that does not exist in unmodified nature. The air has properties that the body responds to in ways that are not entirely comfortable. And over all of this, in the background, the Emperor moves. The emotional texture of operating in a place where all of these elements combine is not simply fear. It is something more complex, a mixture of fear and awe and a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being small in an environment that was built for things that are very much larger. The Blue Gate produces that feeling more reliably and more intensely than anywhere else in the game. The lore's suggestion that the Blue Gate is in some sense a threshold that the ARC have been working toward implies that the work is not finished. The gate has not fully opened, or fully closed, or fully achieved whatever state the ARC intended it to reach. It is in process, and the Emperor's continued movement suggests that the process is still advancing. This creates a specific kind of narrative tension. The raiders are operating in a converted zone that is in the middle of becoming something. They do not know what it is becoming. And the pace of that becoming, driven by the Emperor's slow movement and the relentless ARC activity in the zone, means that what the Blue Gate is today is not what it will be tomorrow or next month, or in whatever time frame the ARC are operating on. The ARC's apparent patience in the prosecution of their work on Earth is one of the more philosophically challenging aspects of their presence. They are not hurrying. The process is proceeding at a pace that is determined by the process itself, not by any external deadline. The Emperor's slow movement is emblematic of this patience. It is not racing toward its destination. It is moving at the pace that its work requires. Human beings have a relationship with time that is governed by the biological reality of individual mortality. The ARC may not share this relationship. They may be operating on a timeline that has nothing to do with the human scale of urgency and deadline. This temporal gap between the ARC's operating timescale and the human operating timescale is one of the most alienating aspects of their presence. The Raiders' experience of this temporal gap is both practical and psychological. On a practical level, it means that the converted zones they operate in will continue to change, slowly but steadily, in the direction the ARC are taking them. On a psychological level, It means that there is a mismatch between the urgency that human survival demands and the pace at which the ARC work proceeds. The Raiders are always pressed for time in specific tactical ways, but the ARC are never pressed for time in any way that Raiders can exploit. This asymmetry is one of the defining features of the Raiders' situation. They are fighting a kind of fight where their opponent is indifferent to the concept of urgency. The blue gate as a threshold implies both a near side and a far side. Raiders operate on the near side, in the converted zone that the ARC have processed to a degree that allows Raider operations without triggering comprehensive ARC response. But the far side of the threshold, whatever is there, is presumably not available for Raider operations in the current version of the game. The Emperor moves in the direction of the far side. Its presence in the background of the blue gate is the near side's most visible connection to whatever lies beyond the threshold. Understanding what lies beyond the blue gate on the far side of the threshold that the Emperor is helping to open or maintain or complete is arguably the central question of ARC Raiders' long-term lore. The lore community's speculation about what lies beyond the blue gate has produced a range of theories, from the relatively prosaic to the genuinely extraordinary. At the prosaic end, theories suggest that the far side of the threshold is simply a more intensively converted zone, a deeper phase of the ARC's industrial operation that requires the Emperor's presence to complete. At the extraordinary end, theories suggest that the blue gate is a transition point for something that goes beyond simple planetary processing, that the ARC's work on Earth is preparation for something that connects Earth to a larger system or network of which the ARC are part. The evidence does not definitively support the extraordinary theories over the prosaic ones, but it also does not rule them out. The Emperor, as a narrative symbol beyond its specific role in the lore, represents the encounter between human scale and something beyond human scale. Every culture has its version of this encounter. Every narrative tradition has found ways to tell the story of what happens when human beings meet something too large to fight, too alien to communicate with, and too important to ignore. The Emperor in ARC Raiders is a contemporary version of that encounter, dressed in the visual language of science fiction, but operating on the same fundamental narrative principle. The significance of the encounter is not determined by the outcome of any single battle. It is determined by what the human beings involved learn about themselves and their situation in the course of confronting something that exceeds their current capacity. The way the developers have managed the Emperor's presence over the course of ARC Raiders' development reflects a sophisticated understanding of how narrative mystery works in game design. They have given players enough to see and enough to wonder about without prematurely resolving the central questions. They have built a world where the Emperor is a real and visible presence while preserving the essential unknowability that makes it compelling. When the time comes to reveal more, to bring the Emperor into direct contact with player operations, the foundation of mystery that has been built will make that revelation carry more weight than it could have if the Emperor had been directly available from the beginning. The patience of the design mirrors the patience of the machine. The Raiders who will eventually be involved in whatever direct engagement with the Emperor the developers are building toward will be engaging with something that has been part of their operational reality for a long time. They will bring to that engagement a body of experience and a set of relationships with the Blue Gate environment that will inform how they approach the challenge. The lore that has been laid down about the Emperor, the fragmented knowledge about its role and its purpose and its connection to the ARC's overall work on Earth will provide a framework for understanding what the engagement means in narrative terms. The mystery will not be erased when the Emperor becomes directly relevant. It will be, ideally, deepened. The community of players who engage with ARC Raiders is itself a piece of the story that the Emperor represents. They are doing, in a very real sense, what the Raiders in the game world are doing. They are moving through a complex and partially understood environment, extracting whatever information they can find, building frameworks to make sense of what they see, and advancing a collective understanding through the accumulation of individual experience. The Emperor is the point around which much of this community activity converges, because it is the element of the game world that is most opaque and most important at the same time. The community is making its own law through the process of trying to understand the law that the developers have built. The tension between what the community knows and what the developers have not yet revealed is a productive tension. It drives engagement. It encourages attention to detail. It rewards the kind of careful, sustained engagement with the game world that makes a player community genuinely invested in a game's narrative. The Emperor is the center of this productive tension. As long as the Emperor remains in the background, moving slowly toward its destination, the tension persists. And as long as the tension persists, the community remains engaged with the question of what the Emperor is and what it will eventually do. The narrative function of the Emperor as a horizon, as something always visible and always ahead, is one of its most important properties. Horizons define the edge of the known world. They are always there. They recede as you approach them, and they mark the boundary between what is currently understood and what remains to be discovered. The Emperor operates as a narrative horizon in ARC Raiders in exactly this way. It is always there. The game world is defined in part by its presence, and as the game develops and more lore is revealed, the Emperor will presumably remain at the edge of what is fully understood, always marking the boundary between the known and the unknown, even as what is known about it grows. The specific qualities that make the Emperor a compelling narrative element are worth enumerating, because they illuminate what kind of storytelling is happening in ARC Raiders at its best. The Emperor is visible but untouchable, present without being immediately relevant to current operations. It is large beyond any individual's experience, producing an encounter with scale that is qualitative different from the experience of smaller ARC units. It is patient, operating on a timescale that does not acknowledge human urgency. It is purposeful, moving in a direction that implies a destination and a task. It is mysterious, in the sense that its specific role and purpose remain incompletely understood. And it is inevitable, in the sense that its movement toward its destination is not something that current player capabilities can interrupt or deflect. Each of these qualities contributes to the narrative weight of the Emperor as a piece of game lore. The intersection of these qualities in a single game element is unusual and reflects a level of intentionality in the design of the ARC Raiders narrative that deserves appreciation. Most games' largest and most powerful enemies are designed primarily to be fought. They are scaled to the challenge of combat. Their mystery is the mystery of tactical complexity, how to defeat them, not the mystery of narrative depth, what they are and what they mean. The Emperor breaks this convention in a way that is both commercially risky and narratively sophisticated. By making the largest thing in the game world something that cannot currently be fought, the developers have committed to a kind of storytelling that requires patience and investment from the audience. The players who are most engaged with the Emperor's lore are the players who have accepted that invitation. Chapter 4. The Emperor's Anatomy and Form. To understand the Emperor as a functional object, you have to try to see it as the ARC would have built it, which means starting with the problem it was designed to solve and working backward to the form that solves it. The ARC did not build the Emperor because it is impressive. They built it because something requires a machine of that size to accomplish. Every element of the Emperor's anatomy, as far as it can be reconstructed from the available visual information in the game, is the answer to a specific engineering challenge. The scale of those challenges, reflected in the scale of the Emperor itself, tells you something about what kind of work the ARC sent it to Earth to do. The legs of the Emperor are the most visually striking feature, simply because of their scale. At mountain size, the legs of a spider-like machine are not legs in the conventional sense. They are more like mobile structural supports, enormous, articulated columns that distribute the Emperor's weight across a large enough footprint to prevent it from sinking into the terrain under its own mass. The engineering challenge of moving something the size of a mountain without destroying the ground beneath it is not trivial. The Emperor's leg design is presumably the ARC's solution to that challenge, a solution that incorporates materials and structural principles that allow enormous mass to move across varied terrain without catastrophic ground failure. The fact that the Emperor can move at all is, in engineering terms, one of the most remarkable things about it. The body of the Emperor, the central structure that the legs support, is large enough to be a geographic feature in its own right. Raiders in the Blue Gate who can see the Emperor from a distance are essentially looking at a moving landmass. The body of the Emperor contains whatever functions make it different from its legs and from the smaller ARC units. The processing systems, the energy systems, whatever sensory apparatus it uses to perceive the world at its operating scale. Whatever communication systems connect it to the broader ARC network. All of these systems are housed in a body that is large enough to contain them at a scale appropriate to the Emperor's function. The size of the body is not aesthetic, it is functional. Every cubic meter of it is there because something inside it requires that space. The surface of the Emperor, as seen from the available visual information in the game, has the characteristic ARC aesthetic, but at a scale that changes its quality. The same design language that makes the smaller units look like large spiders makes the Emperor look like an industrial facility that moves. The features that read as joints and limbs and sensory organs on the smaller units read as architectural elements on the Emperor. Openings that might be exhaust ports or sensory arrays on the smaller units are large enough to be doorways or rooms on the Emperor. The relationship between surface feature and internal function that applies to the smaller units still applies to the Emperor, but the scale shifts the interpretation of almost every element. The blue energy signatures that pervade the Blue Gate map are concentrated around the Emperor in ways that tell you something about its energy consumption. The Emperor is not just large, it is energetically intense in a way that corresponds to its scale. The blue energy visible in its vicinity has a higher intensity than the same signatures elsewhere in the Blue Gate, suggesting that the Emperor is either producing or consuming enormous amounts of energy as part of its normal operation. The relationship between the Emperor's energy profile and the Blue Gate's overall blue signature intensity suggests that the Emperor may be central to whatever energy activity the Blue Gate is the site of. The energy flows in the zone may be organized around the Emperor rather than simply coexisting with it. The movement mechanics of the Emperor are worth thinking about carefully. A machine of its size moving across planetary terrain presents engineering challenges that go well beyond those faced by the smaller ARC units. The smaller units can navigate complex terrain quickly because their mass is manageable and their leg coordination can adapt rapidly to varying terrain. The Emperor's mass is so large that the adaptation time for each leg placement is a significant fraction of its overall movement cycle. This is why the Emperor moves so slowly. It is not designed for rapid movement. It is designed for sustained, stable movement over long distances at low speed. Each step is a commitment. Each repositioning is deliberate. The Emperor does not change direction quickly, but it does eventually arrive. The sensory systems of the Emperor are one of the most speculative areas of the anatomy discussion, but the logic of the Emperor's function requires that they exist and that they operate at a scale appropriate to the Emperor's operational needs. A machine of the Emperor's size engaged in large-scale geological processing needs sensory systems that can perceive geological features at depth. It needs to be able to assess the composition and structure of the material it is processing from the outside before committing to a specific course of action. The sensory apparatus required for this kind of geological perception would be very different from the optical and acoustic sensors that serve the smaller ARC units in their security and patrol functions. The Emperor's sensory systems are probably operating in ranges, and with methods that have no direct human analogue. The energy collection capabilities of the Emperor are another area where the anatomy suggests specific functional elements. If the Emperor requires enormous energy to operate, and its movement through the landscape of the Blue Gate is any indication that it does, then it either carries an enormous energy reserve, or it has systems for collecting energy from its environment as it operates. The ARC's energy infrastructure in the converted zones, with its characteristic blue signatures, looks like collection and transmission infrastructure rather than pure storage. This suggests the ARC prefer active energy collection over carried reserves. The Emperor, as the largest ARC unit, would presumably have the most sophisticated version of whatever energy collection system the smaller ARC units use, scaled to match its energy needs. The defensive capabilities of the Emperor, in the sense of its resilience to external forces, are likely significant. A machine of its size and apparent importance would not be sent to conduct the ARC's most intensive planetary scale operation without being built to survive the kind of opposition it might encounter. The materials of the Emperor's construction are presumably the most advanced ARC materials available. The structural design presumably incorporates redundancy and resilience features that make it capable of continuing to function even under conditions that would stop smaller machines. The Emperor's slow movement and apparent indifference to the raiders in its operational zone is consistent with a machine that is simply not threatened by anything that operates at the scale of current raider capabilities. The internal organization of the Emperor as a complex machine is presumably hierarchical. Different sections of the Emperor probably handle different functions. Some sections are devoted to locomotion, some to energy collection and management, some to whatever primary processing function the Emperor was built to perform, some to whatever communication and coordination function the Emperor serves in the ARC network. Understanding the internal organization of the Emperor would be enormously useful for raiders who eventually need to engage it directly. The anatomy of weakness, the places where damage would have the most significant effect on its function, is ultimately derived from understanding the internal organization. The lore gives us fragments of this understanding. The full picture remains incomplete. The relationship between the Emperor's anatomy and the anatomies of the smaller ARC units is one of design continuity with functional divergence. The same design principles apply across the scale range of ARC units, but the specific application of those principles changes as the scale changes. What serves a small unit well does not simply scale up to serve a large unit well. The Emperor's anatomy represents the ARC's engineering solutions to problems that do not arise at smaller scales. The materials needed for a machine of the Emperor's mass are different from those needed for smaller units. The structural principles needed to keep it stable under its own weight are different. The energy systems needed to power it are different. The Emperor's anatomy is continuous with the smaller units in its design language, but distinct from them in almost every specific engineering detail. The joints of the Emperor's legs deserve specific attention as engineering objects. In a smaller spider-like machine, joints are components that need to be lightweight and fast. They need to enable rapid repositioning of the limb in response to changing terrain. In the Emperor, joints are structural elements that need to bear the weight of the adjacent segments, that need to operate reliably under load cycles of enormous magnitude, and that need to maintain their function over the kind of sustained operation that the Emperor's work implies. The joints of the Emperor are not the same kind of component as the joints of the smaller units. They are more like the hinged components of a bridge or a crane than like the articulated joints of a smaller robot. They work differently, they fail differently, and they have a different relationship to the machine's overall structural integrity. The Emperor's apparent integration of biological design principles, following the general ARC aesthetic, produces a specific quality in its overall anatomy. The Emperor does not look purely mechanical in the way that human industrial machines look mechanical. It has a quality that is simultaneously machine-like and creature-like, as if the biological template that informed the smaller ARC units has been followed to its logical extreme at mountain scale. At that scale, the creature-like qualities of the design become surreal. The Emperor is too big to be a creature, but its design language insists on describing it in creature terms. This tension between the biological aesthetic and the industrial reality of the Emperor's function is one of the more disorienting aspects of encountering it visually. The legs of the Emperor, as noted, are more like structural supports than like the locomotion systems of the smaller units, but they retain the segmented articulated quality of the ARC spider aesthetic. Each leg is composed of segments connected by joints, following the same basic structural principle as the smaller units, but at a scale where each segment is its own structural engineering challenge. The way the segments are proportioned, the way the joints are placed, the way the overall leg geometry distributes the Emperor's mass through its contact points with the ground, all of these reflect design decisions that have functional consequences at the Emperor's scale. Getting these details wrong in the design would mean an Emperor that could not move, or that would destroy the terrain under its own weight, or that would be structurally unstable in ways that would compromise its primary function. The colour and surface texture of the Emperor's anatomy, as visible in the game, are consistent with the ARC aesthetic, but have a quality that the smaller units do not share. The Emperor's surface has been exposed to the elements for a long time. It has the character of something that has been in operation for a sustained period, that has accumulated the marks of its environment and its work. This is different from the smaller ARC units, which tend to appear more freshly maintained, or at least less visibly weathered. The Emperor's apparent age, as suggested by its surface character, is itself a piece of lore. It implies that the Emperor has been doing its work for a long time, that it is not a recent arrival in the Blue Gate, but rather a persistent presence with a history of operation in this environment. The blue energy elements that the ARC design language incorporates throughout the smaller units are present in the Emperor as well, but at a scale that changes their visual character entirely. What reads as a glowing component or an energy conduit on a smaller unit reads as an illuminated architectural feature on the Emperor. Parts of the Emperor glow with the characteristic blue of the ARC energy systems, but these glowing parts are large enough to be buildings. The visual effect, seen from the distance at which most raiders observe the Emperor in the Blue Gate, is of a moving mountain that contains its own light sources, a thing that is simultaneously dark and massive, and lit from within by processes that radiate out through its surface. The mass of the Emperor and the energy it requires to move are worth thinking about in combination. Moving the Emperor requires not just the energy to drive the locomotion systems, but the energy to overcome the inertia of its enormous mass. Getting the Emperor started from a standstill requires an enormous energy input. Maintaining its movement at steady speed requires a continuous energy supply. Stopping it and changing direction requires energy-intensive manipulation of its momentum. All of this suggests that the Emperor's movement patterns, slow as they are not casual or arbitrary. Each movement decision is an energy commitment. The Emperor moves when it needs to move, and it moves to places where what it needs to do requires its presence. Its path is purposeful in a way that is directly tied to the energy cost of that path. The weight of the Emperor on the ground beneath it would produce seismic effects that could be detected at significant distances. Each step of the Emperor is a controlled impact of enormous mass with the ground. The cumulative effect of its movement through the Blue Gate is a sustained low-frequency seismic signature that is different from the background seismic activity of the unconverted Earth. Experienced raiders operating in the Blue Gate might be able to sense the Emperor's movement through the ground, before they can see it, through the specific character of the vibration its steps produce. Whether this constitutes a useful tactical information source depends on how accurately it can be interpreted. But the seismic signature of the Emperor is a real physical consequence of its anatomy operating at its natural scale. The Emperor's anatomy as a weapon, if it functions as one, would be primarily defined by its physical scale rather than by specific weapons systems. A machine of the Emperor's mass does not need purpose-built weapons to be dangerous. Its physical presence is itself a destructive force. The path of the Emperor through any environment is a path of physical transformation. Structures in its way are not obstacles. They are simply smaller things that its movement displaces. Whether the Emperor has purpose-built offensive or defensive systems in addition to its physical scale is something the law does not definitively establish, but the possibility that it does is consistent with the ARC's general design philosophy of equipping their units for the full range of conditions they might encounter. The anatomy of the Emperor relative to the raiders, who might eventually engage it directly, creates an asymmetry that any future encounter design would need to grapple with. A raider is roughly human scale. The Emperor is mountain scale. The ratio between these is so large that any conventional weapons system a raider could carry would be proportionally equivalent to a small insect stinging a mountain. The future engagement with the Emperor that the developers appear to be building toward will presumably involve raiders using tools and methods at a very different scale from their current operations. Either they will need access to ARC-scale weapons technology, or they will need to engage the Emperor at specific vulnerable points in its anatomy that do not require matching its overall scale, or both. The anatomy of the Emperor, as law, is directly relevant to the gameplay question of how this will eventually work. The communication apparatus of the Emperor as a component of its anatomy is presumably present but not visible in the conventional way. The ARC units communicate through means that human beings have not fully decoded. Whatever signals the Emperor exchanges with the broader ARC network are probably operating in ranges and through methods that raiders cannot directly observe. But the effects of the Emperor's communication activity are potentially visible in the behavior of the smaller ARC units around it. If the Emperor issues directives to the broader ARC network, the smaller units in its operational zone might reflect those directives in their behavior. Careful observation of the smaller units in the Blue Gate for patterns that correlate with the Emperor's position or activity might provide indirect evidence of the Emperor's communication activity. The Emperor's anatomy, as a whole, represents the ARC's answer to the question of what kind of machine you build when you need to do something to a planet that no smaller machine can do. The answer they built is a machine that is itself a kind of landscape feature that moves through the terrain rather than across it, that is scaled to the geological dimensions of its work rather than to the biological dimensions of anything it might encounter. Understanding the Emperor's anatomy does not require understanding every engineering detail of how it was built. It requires understanding the functional logic that its form serves. And that functional logic points consistently back to the question of what the ARC are doing on Earth and why they needed the Emperor to do it. The processing elements of the Emperor's anatomy, the parts that engage with whatever material it is processing in the Blue Gate, are the most functionally important and the most speculative. If the Emperor is engaged in geological extraction of some kind, then the parts of its anatomy that conduct that extraction are central to its purpose. These parts would presumably be located at the bottom of the Emperor's body, in contact with or in close proximity to the ground surface. They might look like the roots of a tree at mountain scale, structures that penetrate the surface to access what lies below, or they might look like industrial processing equipment, arrays of components that engage with the ground surface to extract and process materials. The law does not give us a clear visual on these elements, but the functional logic of the Emperor's role in the Blue Gate strongly implies that they exist. The sensory range of the Emperor, at its scale, and with the level of technology the ARC clearly possess, would presumably cover the entire Blue Gate zone easily. The Emperor can probably perceive everything happening in the Blue Gate from its current position. It knows the raiders are there. It knows what they are doing. It chooses not to respond to them in the way the smaller units respond to detected threats. This is not a failure of detection. It is a deliberate choice, presumably a product of the Emperor's operational priorities and its calibration of what constitutes a meaningful threat. The raiders who operate in the Blue Gate are within the Emperor's awareness. They are simply below its threshold of concern. The temporal dimension of the Emperor's anatomy, in the sense of how it changes over time, is another speculative area with interesting implications. Does the Emperor grow? Does it incorporate new materials into itself as it processes the environment? The ARC's general design philosophy of using local materials and integrating environmental elements into their own infrastructure might apply at the Emperor's scale in ways that change the Emperor's physical composition over time. If the Emperor incorporates the geological materials it processes into its own structure, then it is literally built from the ground it passes over. It is, in a sense, a machine that makes itself from the planet as it works. This is a remarkable and somewhat disturbing reading, but it is consistent with the ARC's general approach to resource use. The aesthetic power of the Emperor as a visual object in the game is worth appreciating separately from its functional significance. The developers succeeded in creating something that reads as genuinely alien and genuinely monumental in a way that many science fiction games fail to achieve. The Emperor does not look like a generic giant robot. It looks like a specific kind of thing that was built for a specific kind of purpose by intelligence that thinks about form and function differently than human engineers do. The visual distinctiveness of the Emperor is a function of the design discipline the developers applied to the ARC aesthetic as a whole. They did not scale up a generic robot design. They applied the ARC design logic consistently to the challenges of mountain scale, and the result is something that looks like nothing else in the game or outside it. The way the Emperor is animated in the game, the specific quality of its movement, is part of what makes it effective as a piece of visual storytelling. It does not move like a machine that is capable of moving faster, but has chosen to move slowly. It moves like a machine that is moving at its optimal speed, the speed that its mass and its energy budget and its terrain conditions dictate. The animation conveys the sense that this is correct speed for the Emperor, that it is not constrained or frustrated or capable of more, but choosing less. It is exactly what it is, operating exactly as it was designed to operate. This quality of perfect adequacy to its own nature is part of what makes the Emperor feel so alien. It is not straining toward anything, it simply is. The difference between the Emperor's apparent anatomy and what a human engineer might design to solve similar problems is a useful lens for understanding the ARC's design philosophy more broadly. Human engineers, designing a machine to do geological processing at a planetary scale, would probably design something more purely mechanical. They would probably prioritize modularity and replaceability of components. They would probably design something that looks industrial in the way that human industry looks industrial. The ARC designed something that looks like the largest spider that ever existed, adapted to the challenges of mountain scale with materials and engineering principles that human technology has not reached. This difference is telling. This difference is the ARC's approach to machine design is not converging toward the human approach. It is following its own logic, its own aesthetic, its own engineering philosophy to places that human design has not gone. The Emperor, in the end, is not just a large ARC unit. It is the fullest expression of the ARC design philosophy at the largest scale the ARC have deployed on Earth. Everything that makes the smaller hierarchy units interesting and alien and impressive is present in the Emperor, amplified to the point where it changes from impressive to overwhelming. The spider-like anatomy, the integration of biological design principles with mechanical construction, the energy systems with their characteristic blue signatures, the material quality that distinguishes ARC construction from human construction. All of these elements are in the Emperor at a scale where they stop being features of a machine and start being features of a landscape. The Emperor is the most complete physical expression of what the ARC are, and understanding it is, in a very real sense, understanding them. The future of the Emperor as a gameplay and narrative element will presumably involve the raiders eventually gaining access to some way of engaging directly with this anatomy. Whether that means developing weapons capable of damaging Emperor scale systems, or finding specific vulnerabilities in the Emperor's architecture that allow targeted intervention, or using ARC technology itself to create tools capable of affecting Emperor scale structures, the eventual engagement will be an encounter with the Emperor's anatomy in a practical sense. The law that has been laid down about how the Emperor is built, what its functional systems are, and where its potential vulnerabilities lie is the groundwork for that encounter. The anatomy discussion is not just interesting as background lore, it is potentially the tutorial for the most significant challenge the game will eventually offer. The Emperor's anatomy is also a statement about the ARC's resources and their willingness to commit those resources to Earth. Building something the size of a mountain and sending it to a specific planet to do a specific job is not a trivial undertaking for any civilization, no matter how advanced. The fact that the ARC built the Emperor and sent it to Earth tells you something about how important Earth is to whatever the ARC are trying to accomplish. Planets that merit Emperor-scale investment are not incidental targets. They are significant sites in whatever plan the ARC are executing. Earth, as the host planet of the Emperor's operations, is presumably a critical piece of the ARC's larger puzzle. What makes Earth critical enough to merit this level of investment is the question that the Emperor's anatomy, ultimately, is a clue to answering. Chapter 7. The mythology of the unreachable. Every human culture that has ever existed has developed mythology around the things it cannot control. The storms, the deep ocean, the darkness beyond the firelight, the things that are too large or too old or too powerful to be addressed by any individual human effort. These myths are not failures of understanding. They are sophisticated responses to a real problem, the problem of how to live in a world that contains things that exceed your capacity while still functioning as a person who needs to make decisions and take actions and maintain the psychological coherence to do both. The ARC invasion created a world full of things that exceed human capacity. The Emperor is the largest of them, and the mythology that has grown up around it among the survivors is a piece of the lore that deserves serious attention. The myths that survivor communities tell about the Emperor, in whatever fragments of that mythology the game's lore preserves, are not simple stories. They are not the kind of myth that explains the origin of fire or the reason for seasons. They are the kind of myth that explains how to live with the presence of something that cannot be fought or fled, something that simply is and that will continue to be, regardless of what any individual human does about it. This kind of myth is harder to tell and harder to hear. It does not resolve into comfort. It resolves into a way of carrying the weight of the thing, of incorporating it into a framework of meaning that allows the people carrying it to keep moving. The name the survivors gave the Emperor is, as discussed earlier, a mythological act in itself. Naming is one of the foundational operations of myth. You take the formless or the overwhelming, and you give it a name, and the name becomes a container for the meaning you assign to it. Emperor is a name that contains a specific set of implications. It implies hierarchy. It implies authority. It implies that there is something beneath the Emperor in the order of things, something that the Emperor stands above in a way that structures the world around the relationship. By calling the largest ARC unit the Emperor, the survivors were not just labelling it, they were placing it in a story that has human beings in it, a story where the Emperor's authority over the converted zones is real but also comprehensible in human terms. Because emperors are things that human civilizations have had before. They are terrible and they are powerful, but they are not entirely alien. They are a category of thing that human experience has frameworks for. The mythology of the Emperor probably includes stories about people who have gotten close to it and survived to tell the tale. In any human community operating in the shadow of an overwhelming force, the people who have had direct experience with that force become mythologized. They become carriers of a special kind of knowledge that was obtained at enormous cost, knowledge that has a weight and a credibility that second-hand accounts cannot match. The raiders who have operated in the Blue Gate long enough and skillfully enough to have been in meaningful visual proximity to the Emperor are the holders of this kind of knowledge in the ARC Raiders world. Their accounts of what the Emperor looks like up close, of what it feels like to be near something of that scale, of what the sound and the ground vibration of its movement are like when you are not seeing it from a safe distance, are pieces of lore that the survivor communities treat with the specific reverence that mythologized experience commands. The fear that the Emperor produces in people who know about it is not the same fear that the smaller ARC units produce. The smaller units are dangerous in a way that triggers specific, tactical fear, the kind of fear that sharpens attention and accelerates response. They are threats that can be responded to, even if the response is limited and imperfect. The Emperor produces a different kind of fear, a fear that has nowhere to go. You cannot sharpen your attention against the Emperor in a way that helps. You cannot accelerate your response in a way that matters. The Emperor's existence is simply a fact of the world, and the fear it produces has to be absorbed and lived with, rather than acted on. This is the kind of fear that becomes mythology. When you cannot fight something and cannot flee it, you build a story around it. You find a way to make its existence mean something that you can carry without being destroyed by it. The survivor communities that have developed the most elaborate mythologies around the Emperor are probably the ones who've been living closest to the Blue Gate for the longest time. Proximity and duration of exposure create the conditions for mythological elaboration. The community that has watched the Emperor moving in the background of their world for years has had time to observe it carefully, to accumulate accounts of it, to test interpretations against new observations, and to build a body of understanding that goes beyond tactical knowledge into something more like cosmological understanding. What is the Emperor in the order of things? Not just what does it do, but what does its existence mean for how the world is structured? These are the questions that mythology addresses, and these are the questions that the communities closest to the Blue Gate have had the most time and reason to work on. The mythology of the Emperor is not static. It develops as new information becomes available, and as the Emperor itself moves and changes the environment. Each time the Emperor does something new, or moves to a new position, or appears to respond to something in its environment in an unexpected way, the mythology updates. New stories get added. Old interpretations get revised. The framework of meaning that the community has built around the Emperor has to accommodate new evidence, and the process of that accommodation is itself a piece of community life, a shared project of understanding that keeps the Emperor at the center of the community's collective attention, even when it is not directly threatening anyone. The role of the Emperor in the mythology of hope is one of the more surprising aspects of its symbolic function. You might expect that something as overwhelming and alien as the Emperor would feature only in stories of doom and loss, and it does feature in those stories. The Emperor is a real element of a genuinely terrible situation, but the mythology of hope needs its overwhelming obstacles as much as the mythology of fear does, because hope is most powerful when it is hope against something that truly deserves the fear it produces. The raiders who enter the Blue Gate, who operate in the Emperor's operational zone, who extract resources from an environment that a mountain-sized alien machine is actively processing, are in some sense heroes of hope in the mythological framework of their communities. They are people who go into the shadow of the incomprehensible and come back with something useful. The Emperor's presence in the background of the Blue Gate makes their achievement meaningful in the way that myth makes things meaningful. The size of the obstacle dignifies the effort of navigating around it. The children who grow up in survivor communities in the shadow of the Blue Gate and the Emperor are growing up in a world where the Emperor has always been there. For them, it is not a rupture with a prior normalcy, it is simply part of the world as they have always known it. This changes the character of the mythology they receive and build around it. For adults who remember the pre-invasion world, the Emperor is a symbol of loss and displacement. For children who have never known a world without it, the Emperor is a different kind of symbol, something that has always defined the horizon of their world, always marked the boundary between the known and the unknown. The mythology these children build around the Emperor is probably different in character from the mythology of the adults, less about what was lost and more about what might be possible in a world where the Emperor exists as a constant. The oral tradition around the Emperor, in a community without stable infrastructure for written record-keeping, would carry the mythology in forms that adapt with each telling. The stories about the Emperor that a survivor community tells are not fixed texts. They are living narratives that change as the tellers and the listeners change. Details get added that were not in the original account. Interpretations get embedded in the narrative that were not there at the beginning. The figure of the Emperor in the oral tradition of the survivor communities is probably by now a composite of many different accounts and many different layers of interpretation. A mythological object that is both grounded in real observation and elaborated far beyond what any individual observer could have seen. The gap between the real Emperor and the mythological Emperor is a gap that every human culture fills in its own way. The survivor communities of ARC raiders are filling it in the way that people under extraordinary pressure fill it, with whatever meaning allows them to keep going. The question of what it does to a person psychologically to spend their working life in the operational zone of the Emperor is one that the lore touches on obliquely. The raiders who operate in the Blue Gate regularly are not the same people after extended service there that they were before it. The sustained exposure to an environment defined by the Emperor's presence does something to the human sense of scale and self that is difficult to undo. You come back from enough Blue Gate operations with a different relationship to your own size in the world. The Emperor makes everything else small by comparison, including the problems that seemed large before you started working in its shadow. Some raiders find this liberating. The small problems of community politics and resource competition that occupy so much attention in the survivor settlements become genuinely small after you have spent enough time in the operational zone of something that is large on a geological scale. Other raiders find it disorienting in ways that are harder to manage. The sense that you are a minor detail in a very large process is not always a comfortable sense to carry. And the mythology that communities have built around the Emperor serves, among other things, to help raiders manage this psychological reality when they return from the Blue Gate. The myth gives the experience a framework. It makes the disorientation meaningful rather than simply destabilizing. The Emperor as a religious symbol in communities that have developed religious frameworks in response to the ARC invasion is a dimension of the mythology that the lore leaves open, but that the internal logic of the game world strongly suggests. Human communities under extreme duress tend to develop or intensify religious frameworks. The ARC invasion would be an extreme enough event to generate significant religious response in any population with prior religious traditions, and to generate new religious frameworks in populations that might not have had strong prior traditions. The Emperor, as the most visible and most overwhelming element of the ARC presence would naturally become a focus of religious attention in these frameworks. Whether as an object of fear that religious practice helps manage, or as a symbol of cosmic forces that religious interpretation helps make meaningful, or as a challenge that religious heroism is defined against, the Emperor is exactly the kind of thing that human religious imagination engages with. The specific character of the religious interpretation would vary by community. Communities with traditions of apocalyptic religion would probably read the Emperor through an apocalyptic lens, as a harbinger of an end that has already begun. Communities with traditions of animism or panpsychism might read the Emperor as a kind of spirit or force, alien but comprehensible within a framework where the world is full of purposeful agents that are not human. Communities with more secular philosophical traditions might develop interpretations of the Emperor that are closer to what this video has been doing, analytical frameworks that treat the Emperor as a mystery to be understood, rather than a symbol to be interpreted. But even secular frameworks for understanding the Emperor have a quasi-religious dimension, because the Emperor is the thing at the limit of what current understanding can encompass. And the limit of understanding is always, in some sense, a religious frontier. The mythology of the Emperor, taken as a whole, is a mirror held up to the human communities of the ARC Raiders world. What they see in the Emperor, what they make of its presence, what stories they tell about it, and what meanings they assign to it, all of this reflects what they are and what they have become under the pressure of the invasion. The Emperor itself is the same, regardless of what the survivors say about it. It moves at its own pace toward its own destination, in pursuit of its own purposes. But the mythology around it is entirely human, entirely a product of the specific combination of intelligence and imagination and terror and hope that human beings bring to encounters with the incomprehensible. And in a world where the ARC have taken so much that was human, the mythology of the Emperor is a piece of evidence that something essentially human remains. The stories are still being told, the frameworks are still being built, the questions are still being asked. As long as that is true, the Emperor has not entirely won. Chapter 5. What the Emperor wants. The question of motivation is a strange one to apply to a machine. Machines do not want things in the way that biological creatures want things. They pursue objectives, they execute functions, they fulfill the purposes they were built to serve. But the ARC blur this distinction in ways that make the language of motivation genuinely applicable to them in a way it is not applicable to simpler machines. The Emperor moves with a purposefulness that exceeds simple programming. It is pursuing something. And the question of what it is pursuing is the same question as the question of what the ARC came to Earth to accomplish. Because the Emperor is not a peripheral piece of the ARC's work here. It is central to it. The most straightforward reading of the Emperor's behaviour in the Blue Gate is that it is engaged in extraction. The geological evidence, the concentration of ARC processing activity, the energy infrastructure that the Blue Gate hosts, all of these point toward a site where the ARC are taking something from the Earth. Not taking in the way a conqueror takes tribute, taking in the way a mining operation takes ore. Systematically, at depth, according to a plan that identifies specific materials at specific locations and commits the appropriate resources to extracting them. The Emperor is the appropriate resource for whatever is at depth in the Blue Gate. Nothing smaller could reach it, or process it, or move it to wherever it needs to go next. What that material is, at geological depth in the Blue Gate, is something the law does not name directly, but the evidence constrains the possibilities in interesting ways. The ARC are not mining for resources that human civilization also uses. If they wanted iron or copper or silicon, they would not need to convert the planet's surface and deploy mountain-scale machines to get them. Whatever the ARC are after exists at depths and in concentrations that make the Blue Gate's specific location significant and that require the Emperor specifically to access. The candidates, in the framework of what the ARC appear to be doing on Earth as a whole, are probably materials that participate in the ARC's energy systems, or materials that participate in the ARC's construction processes at their largest scale, or materials that serve a purpose that human beings have not yet conceptualized because the need for them does not exist at human scales of operation. The relationship between what the Emperor wants and what the broader ARC system wants is worth thinking about carefully. The Emperor does not have independent goals in the way that a biological creature has independent goals shaped by its own survival instincts and social context. Its goals are the goals of the ARC system as a whole, expressed at the Emperor's scale. Whatever the ARC came to Earth to do, the Emperor is the part of the doing that requires a machine of its size. This means that understanding the Emperor's specific task is a way of understanding one piece of the ARC's overall purpose on Earth, and that piece, because of its scale, is probably not a peripheral piece. It is probably a primary piece. The patience with which the Emperor pursues its objectives is one of its most significant behavioral characteristics. The smaller ARC units exhibit a kind of urgency in their patrol and security activities that the Emperor does not share. They respond rapidly to detected threats. They escalate their responses based on the level of threat. They operate with what looks like tactical awareness of time pressure. The Emperor does none of this. It moves at its own pace, directed by its own internal schedule, indifferent to the urgency that governs everything else in the Blue Gate. This patience is not a character trait in the biological sense. It is a design feature. The Emperor was built to operate over timescales that have nothing to do with the rapid response timescales of security operations. What the Emperor wants, expressed in the most practical terms, is probably to complete a specific phase of the ARC's work at the Blue Gate. The converted zone, as it currently exists, is not the end state. It is an intermediate stage. The Emperor is working through that intermediate stage toward whatever comes next in the ARC's process. When the Emperor's work in the Blue Gate is finished, the Blue Gate will be different. Different in ways that raiders might not recognize. Different in ways that might make it no longer useful as a resource extraction zone for human operations. Or different in ways that make it into something that serves the ARC's next stage in a form that cannot currently be imagined. The Emperor's objective is the transformation of the Blue Gate into whatever it needs to become for the ARC's process to advance. The possibility that the Emperor's work in the Blue Gate is connected to something happening elsewhere on Earth, or somewhere beyond Earth, is one the law keeps open in a productive way. The ARC's operation on this planet is coordinated. Different sites are being worked simultaneously. The materials and energy flows from one site presumably connect to what is happening at other sites. The Blue Gate, as a site of particularly intensive ARC activity, might be providing something that other sites need, or receiving something from other sites that it needs, or doing work that is only meaningful in combination with work being done at locations far away. The Emperor's role in this larger connected system might be more significant than its local activity in the Blue Gate suggests. It might be the keystone of a planetary scale process, the piece without which nothing else can advance. The question of whether the Emperor is aware of its own purpose is philosophically interesting in the context of the ARC law. The ARC units appear to have something like situational awareness, an understanding of their immediate operational environment that goes beyond simple stimulus response. Whether this extends to the Emperor having something like self-knowledge, an awareness of what it is and what it is for, is a question the law leaves deliberately open. A machine of the Emperor's complexity might have internal representations of its own function that constitute something like self-understanding, or it might be a very sophisticated system that pursues its objectives without anything resembling awareness of them. The law framework of ARC raiders does not commit to either answer, which is the right choice. The question of machine consciousness, at the Emperor's scale, is genuinely open, both in the context of the game and in the broader context of philosophy of mind. The Emperor's relationship to the smaller ARC units in its operational zone can be understood as an expression of what it wants in behavioral terms. The smaller units maintain the security of the Emperor's operational zone. They process materials at a scale that prepares them for the Emperor's higher-level operations. They maintain the ARC's infrastructure in the Blue Gate in a condition that serves the Emperor's work. Whether this constitutes a command relationship, where the Emperor directs the smaller units, or a coordination relationship, where the smaller units and the Emperor each respond to the same system-level objectives in complementary ways, the functional result is the same. The Blue Gate is organized around the Emperor's needs. Everything else in the zone serves its work. What the Emperor wants, in the deepest sense the law supports, is to finish, to complete the task it was sent to Earth to do. Whatever that completion looks like, whatever transformation of the Blue Gate or of the Earth it represents, the Emperor is oriented toward it with the patient, total commitment of a machine that was built for one purpose and has been pursuing that purpose since before any current raider was born. The completion it seeks is not a battle won. It is a process finished, a geological or planetary transformation achieved. A phase of the ARC's work on Earth advanced to the point where the next phase can begin. And what happens to the Blue Gate, to the raiders who operate there, and to the human communities that depend on them? When that completion comes, is the question that the Emperor's slow movement toward its destination has always been building toward. Chapter 6: Implications for the Future. The developers of ARC Raiders have placed the Emperor in their game world with a care and intentionality that implies a long-term plan. The evidence in the current version of the game is not all there is. It is the foundation. What is being built on that foundation in terms of future narrative developments and gameplay expansions is something that can be read from the current lore only partially and with appropriate humility about the limits of that reading. But the partial reading is itself valuable because it helps position the community to engage with future reveals in an informed way, to recognize the significance of new information when it arrives rather than encountering it without context. The most significant implication of the Emperor's presence for the future of ARC Raiders is that the current operational status of the Blue Gate is temporary. The zone as it now exists, with its specific ARC activity patterns and its specific risk-reward profile for raider operations, will not remain stable indefinitely. The Emperor is changing the Blue Gate. It is changing it slowly, and according to a plan that the raiders are not fully aware of. When those changes reach a threshold that matters in gameplay terms, the Blue Gate will be a different place. The community should expect that the zone they have learned to operate in will eventually become something they need to learn again. The implications for raider communities and the survivor populations they serve are similarly significant. The resources that come from the Blue Gate are important to the survival economy of the human communities in the game world. When the Blue Gate changes, when the Emperor's work advances to a point where current raider operations become untenable, or the zone's character changes fundamentally, the communities that depend on Blue Gate extractions will face a new challenge. This is not just a gameplay consideration. It is a narrative statement about the relationship between human survival and ARC planetary scale operations. The human communities are not just at risk from direct ARC aggression. They are at risk from the secondary consequences of ARC work progressing to completion in areas they currently depend on. The future confrontation with the Emperor, in whatever form the developers ultimately design it, will presumably require raiders to operate at a level of coordination and resource commitment that current operations do not require. The gap between what raiders can currently do and what engaging the Emperor would require is not a gap that closes gradually through normal gameplay progression. It is a qualitative gap, a difference in kind rather than degree. Closing it will probably require specific events or developments in the game's narrative that create the conditions for Emperor-scale engagement. The law that has been laid down creates an expectation of what those conditions might look like, while deliberately withholding the specifics. The broader narrative of ARC raiders, as suggested by the law architecture around the Emperor, is ultimately a story about scale. It is about what happens when human beings encounter a challenge that exceeds the scale of everything they have previously faced, and about how they adapt, what they build, and what they become in response to that challenge. The Emperor is the furthest expression of the scale problem. It is the thing that most completely exceeds the current capacity of the human response. And the story of how the raiders eventually develop the means to engage with something at the Emperor's scale is the story that all the current law is building toward. That story is not finished, but its shape is beginning to be visible. The questions that the Emperor raises for the community to sit with while that story develops are the best kind of questions. They are not trivial mysteries with answers that can be looked up. They are genuine uncertainties with real narrative weight. Uncertainties about what the ARC are doing to the planet, about what the Blue Gate is a gate to, about what the Emperor will do when its work is finished, and about whether human beings will have any meaningful role in the world that comes after. These are questions that the developers planted deliberately in the form of a mountain-sized machine, moving slowly through the background of their game world. They are questions that every raider who looks up and sees the Emperor in the distance is implicitly asking, and they are questions that this channel will keep exploring as long as the Emperor keeps moving. If you made it to the end of this one, I want to say genuinely that it means a lot. The Emperor is the piece of ARC Raiders lore I have wanted to do a deep dive on for a long time, and getting to build this video the way it deserved to be built took real effort. If any of this changed how you see the Blue Gate when you're running ops there, or gave you a new framework for thinking about what the ARC are and what they're doing, then it did what it was supposed to do. Subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment with your own theory about what the Emperor is ultimately building toward, and I will see you in the next one. That brings the script to a clean close across all 6 chapters. The final 2 chapters maintain the same deliberate, layered analysis style, while moving from speculation toward narrative conclusion and the community-facing sign-off that matches the tone of the opening. Let me know if you'd like any section expanded, reordered, or adjusted in tone. Chapter 8, Echoes and Ancestors. The Emperor did not arrive on Earth fully formed from nothing. Whatever process produced it, whatever civilization or system designed and built it, that origin is legible in the Emperor's form and function if you know how to read it. The ARC did not invent the spider-like body plan by accident. They did not arrive at the integration of biological and mechanical principles through coincidence. The Emperor's anatomy is the product of a design tradition with a history, and the echoes of that history are present in the Emperor's form in ways that connect it to something larger and older than its current deployment on Earth. The question of ARC origins is one that the lore of ARC raiders treats with appropriate restraint. Too definitive an answer would reduce the ARC to something bounded and comprehensible in a way that works against the narrative's best qualities. But the question is too important to ignore entirely, and the available evidence does constrain the possibilities in ways worth exploring. The ARC are clearly not a new thing. Their technology, their design philosophy, the scale of their operation on Earth, all of these speak to a tradition of development that extends back much further than the invasion of this particular planet. Whatever the ARC are, they have been whatever they are for a long time. The spider-like design tradition of the ARC has ancestors, whether in biological evolution or in prior iterations of their own machine design. The choice of a multi-legged body plan as the basis for machine construction is not an obvious one. Human engineering, when it developed machines for terrain navigation, generally chose wheeled or tracked designs, not legged ones, because wheels and tracks are more mechanically simple and more energy efficient for the standard terrain conditions human engineers were designing for. The ARC's preference for leg designs over wheeled or tracked ones reflects a different set of operating assumptions. It reflects experience with terrain conditions more varied and more extreme than anything that informed human engineering traditions. The ARC designed for the worst terrain because they had operated in the worst terrain. Their design tradition carries the lessons of that experience. Whether the ARC are biological in origin, whether the intelligence that designed them was itself a living thing or a machine intelligence, is a question the law does not answer. But the evidence leans in interesting directions. The integration of biological principles into the ARC's machine design is too thorough and too sophisticated to be accidental. The ARC did not arrive at biomimicry by coincidence. They arrived at it because the relationship between biological and mechanical design is a central principle of their engineering tradition. This could mean that the ARC were designed by biological beings who drew deeply on their own biology as an engineering template. Or it could mean that the ARC themselves are a kind of machine evolution that arrived independently at the same design solutions that biology arrived at through natural selection. Both readings are consistent with the available evidence. Neither can be definitively excluded. The ancestors of the Emperor, if we understand ancestors to mean prior machines in the same design tradition, would be a fascinating subject of study. The Emperor is presumably not the first machine the ARC built at mountain scale. It is presumably an iteration on a design that was tested and refined through prior versions, each one more capable and more sophisticated than its predecessor. The specific solutions the Emperor embodies, the specific engineering answers its anatomy represents, are the products of a development process that tested and discarded many alternative approaches before arriving at what currently moves through the Blue Gate. The Emperor is not a prototype, it is a mature expression of a design tradition. And that tradition has a history. The possibility that there are records of earlier iterations of the ARC's design tradition somewhere in the converted zones of ARC raiders is one that the law community has found compelling. If the ARC's older machines are present in the game world, either as ruins or as still operational units of a prior generation, the evidence they carry about the ARC's design evolution would be enormously informative. A machine from an earlier phase of ARC development would show a different balance of the elements that the current machines embody. It would show the ARC's design philosophy at an earlier stage of refinement. And the differences between earlier and current designs would tell you something about what problems the ARC encountered and what solutions they developed in response. The evolution of the ARC's machines is a history. Reconstructing even fragments of that history would change the current understanding of the Emperor significantly. The place of the Emperor in the ARC's own history, from the ARC's perspective, is something that the law leaves completely open. The ARC do not communicate their history to human beings. They do not leave records that human beings can read. Their artifacts carry information, but it is encoded in ways that human analysis has not fully decoded. What the Emperor means to the ARC, where it sits in the narrative of their own development and their own understanding of their mission, is genuinely unknown. Whether the ARC have anything like a narrative, anything like a sense of their own history as a story with a trajectory, is a question that the law treats as genuinely open and that may never be resolved from the human side of the encounter. The relationship between the Emperor and the ARC's broader territorial activity across Earth is worth thinking about in terms of precedent and pattern. If the Emperor is a mature expression of the ARC's most intensive planetary scale operations, and if the ARC have conducted prior planetary scale operations on other worlds before Earth, then the Blue Gate is not unique. There are or were other Blue Gates on other worlds, in other star systems. There were or are other Emperors doing the same work in other locations that required the same category of machine. The ARC's activity on Earth is not an experiment. It is a procedure that they have executed before, possibly many times, and that the Emperor represents the primary piece of equipment for. Earth is a site in a larger project. The Blue Gate is a type of site that appears in that larger project wherever the underlying conditions require it, and the Emperor is the tool that the project deploys at those sites. This reading of the Emperor as a tool in a repeated procedure, rather than a unique actor in a unique event, has implications for how the law frames the human response to the ARC. If the ARC have done this before, then the question of whether any prior civilization successfully resisted or survived a process of this kind is genuinely important. Were there other species on other worlds who faced an emperor in the background of their operational zones? Did any of them develop the means to engage it? Did any of them survive the completion of the ARC's process? The answers to these questions, which the law does not provide because human beings in the game world have no access to them, would be the most valuable possible intelligence for the survivor communities of Earth. Knowing that a prior civilization survived what is happening now would change everything about how the human response is organized. Knowing that none did would change everything in a different direction. The echoes of prior planetary operations, if any exist in the ARC's deployed equipment, would be subtle, but potentially detectable. Machines that have operated on multiple worlds over extended periods would carry the physical evidence of that history. Materials from prior operations incorporated into their structure. Environmental processing marks from different atmospheric and geological conditions. The specific wear patterns of extended operation. If the Emperor is a machine that has operated on other worlds before Earth, those worlds are physically present in it, embedded in its surface and its structure, as the accumulated residue of prior work. Raiders who eventually gain access to the Emperor's surface or interior might be able to read that history in the physical evidence. The Emperor might carry within it the answer to the question of what happened on the worlds it processed before it came here. The design ancestry of the smaller ARC units, visible in their functional specialization, reflects a design tradition that solved the problem of machine organization through diversification rather than through the creation of a single, generalized machine. The ARC did not build one machine type that does everything. They built many machine types, each specialized for a specific category of work, operating in coordination to accomplish together what no individual type could accomplish alone. This design philosophy is consistent across the scale range of ARC units, from the smallest patrol bot to the Emperor. Each is specialized for its work, and the fact that the Emperor exists as a specialized unit, the largest and most resource-intensive one, means that there is work that requires that level of specialization. The Emperor was not built as the ARC's ultimate general-purpose machine. It was built because a specific category of work requires exactly what the Emperor is. The ancestors of the Blue Gate, the prior sites on prior worlds where ARC operations of this type were conducted, are a haunting presence in the lore even though they are never named or described. Every time a raider looks at the blue energy signatures in the Blue Gate, they are looking at a technology that was developed through the processing of other worlds. Every time they see the Emperor moving in the background, they are seeing a machine that may have moved through the backgrounds of other converted zones on other planets, doing the same work, pursuing the same objective until it was finished and moved on. The Blue Gate is one instance of a type. The Emperor is one deployment of a category. The specific human tragedy of the invasion is real and enormous. But it is set against a backdrop of ARC activity that is older and larger than this particular world, and that context changes the scale of the story that ARC Raiders is telling. It is not just a story about Earth, it is a story about what it means to be a small world in the operational territory of something very large and very old. The question of what the ARC do after they finish is one that the lore raises through the implications of this reading without directly addressing. If the ARC have completed operations on prior worlds, those worlds still exist. The process has a before and an after. The after is whatever the converted planet looks like when the ARC have extracted what they came for, and the processing is complete. For the human beings of ARC raiders, the fear is that the after is a world where biological life is no longer possible. But that fear is not confirmed by the law. The ARC's apparent indifference to human beings is not the same as the ARC's desire to destroy human life. It is the indifference of an industrial process to the organisms it displaces. Industrial processes do not hate the things they displace. They simply do not include them in the parameters they are optimizing for. What the world looks like after the ARC finish is genuinely unknown, and that unknowing is one of the places where hope still lives in the ARC Raiders' lore. The legacy of the ARC's ancestors, in the sense of what they established that makes the current Emperor possible, is a thread the lore leaves for future development to pull on. The capabilities the Emperor possesses were not invented for this mission. They were accumulated through prior missions, refined through prior failures, and brought to Earth in their current refined form, because the ARC's design tradition is old enough and deep enough to have solved the problems of mountain-scale geological processing on multiple worlds before this one. That legacy is inside the Emperor, and at some point, when raiders gain access to the Emperor's interior, or when the narrative is ready to reveal it, the legacy of those prior worlds will be part of what they find. The echoes of the ARC's own history, visible in the Emperor's design and in the Blue Gate's specific character as a type of site in a larger ARC operational catalogue, are ultimately evidence of something the human characters in ARC Raiders are only beginning to understand. They are not dealing with a new thing. They are dealing with the latest instance of something very old. The Blue Gate has been opened before. The Emperor has done this work before. And the human communities that are trying to survive and resist and ultimately respond to what is happening to their planet are not the first to face this situation, even if they are the first among their own species to face it. That history, the history of prior encounters with the ARC on prior worlds, is the deepest lore that ARC Raiders is building toward, and the Emperor, as the most direct physical link between Earth's current situation and the ARC's long operational history, is the key to accessing it. Chapter 9. The language of the ARC. Every intelligence that has ever existed has had a language. Not necessarily a spoken language, not necessarily a written one, but some system of encoding and transmitting meaning between its constituent parts. The ARC are no exception. They communicate. The evidence for this is visible in the coordinated behaviour of their units, in the way information about raider activity propagates through a zone faster than any individual unit could physically carry it, in the way the ARC's construction activity across different sites follows consistent patterns that require some form of shared specification. The ARC have a language. Human beings have not decoded it, but the attempt to decode it and the partial progress that has been made is one of the most important frontiers in the lore of ARC Raiders. The first thing to establish about the ARC's language is that it is almost certainly not a language in the conventional sense of a sequence of discrete symbols arranged according to syntactic rules to produce semantic content. Human languages and the communication systems of most biological organisms work through the encoding of meaning in sequences of signals. You produce a sequence of sounds or marks or gestures, and a receiver, with the appropriate training, decodes the meaning of that sequence. This architecture has enormous advantages for biological communication. It is flexible, learnable, and capable of expressing novel meaning through novel combinations of existing elements. But it is not the only possible architecture for communication, and the ARC, with their integrated design philosophy and their distributed intelligence model, probably do not use it. The ARC's communication is more likely to work through something like state propagation, where meaning is carried not in discrete sequences of signals, but in the holistic configuration of a system at a given moment. When an ARC unit detects a radar, it does not send a message to other units saying detection event at these coordinates. It changes its own state in response to the detection, and that state change propagates through the network of ARC units in the zone in a way that changes their states as well. The information content of the communication is embedded in the pattern of state changes across the network, not in any individual unit's output. This is a fundamentally different architecture from human language, and it is one that is very difficult for human analysis to decode because it has no obvious units or boundaries. The blue energy signatures that pervade the converted zones are potentially a visual component of the ARC's communication activity. The patterns in those signatures, which appear to vary in ways that do not correlate simply with energy consumption or structural function, might be carrying information as well as energy. The ARC may not maintain a strict separation between their communication systems and their energy systems. In an integrated design philosophy, energy flows that also carry information would be more efficient than separate systems for each function. If the blue signatures in the blue gate are simultaneously an energy distribution system and a communication network, then the patterns visible in those signatures are a text that raiders have been looking at without recognizing it as one. The Emperor's role in the ARC's communication network is presumably significant. A machine of its size and apparent complexity is not simply a passive node in the network. It is, in the distributed intelligence model of ARC communication, probably one of the most computationally and communicatively significant nodes in the entire Blue Gate zone. The state of the Emperor, at any given moment, is presumably influencing the states of every other ARC unit in its operational zone. Its presence in the zone is not just a physical presence, it is a communicative presence, a continuous transmission of information about the Emperor's current state and operational priorities that shapes the behavior of everything around it. The smaller ARC units in the Blue Gate are not ignoring the Emperor. They are, in a very real sense, constantly in conversation with it. The partial attempts that human researchers and raiders have made to decode the ARC's communication system are, from the lore perspective, one of the most important and most frustrating threads in the game's background narrative. The fragments of ARC signal data that have been extracted from destroyed ARC units, the patterns in the blue signatures that careful observers have recorded, the behavioral correlations between different units that suggest coordinated response to shared information, all of these are pieces of a puzzle that human analysis has been working on since the early days of the invasion. The progress has been slow. The language is genuinely alien in its architecture. But even partial progress has had practical value, and the lore suggests that the raiders, with the deepest understanding of the ARC's communication patterns, are among the most effective operators in the converted zones. What the Emperor is saying in the continuous state propagation that its presence in the Blue Gate represents is a question that the lore treats as genuinely meaningful rather than rhetorical. If the ARC's communication is a language, even a very alien one, then the Emperor's ongoing communication activity is content. It is about something. It is conveying information to the network that the network uses to shape its behavior. Decoding even a small part of what the Emperor is communicating to the broader ARC presence in the Blue Gate would be the most significant intelligence breakthrough the survivor communities have achieved. It would give them access to the Emperor's operational intentions in a way that no amount of behavioral observation can fully substitute for. The language of the ARC, and specifically the Emperor's contribution to it, is not an academic puzzle. It is a survival question. The sensory input that the ARC's language processes is itself a piece of the puzzle. What the ARC attend to, what information their sensory systems collect and transmit through the network, shapes what their communication is about, in the same way that the sensory capabilities of biological organisms shape the content of their communication. Human language is rich in color terms because human beings have trichromatic vision. Human language is rich in emotional vocabulary because human beings have complex social emotions. The ARC's language, by extension, would be rich in whatever kinds of information that ARC sensory systems are designed to collect. If those systems are primarily oriented toward geological and energy-related data, as the evidence suggests, then the ARC's communication is primarily about geological and energy-related content. The Emperor's transmissions are probably, in this reading, detailed ongoing reports about the state of the geological materials it is processing and the energy flows it is managing in the Blue Gate. The question of whether the ARC's language can be learned by human beings is one the law leaves provocatively open. Human beings have a remarkable capacity for language acquisition, and the history of human contact with other human cultures demonstrates that even very different communication systems can be learned with sufficient exposure and motivation. But the ARC's communication system is not simply a different human language. It is a different architecture of communication, one that may not be learnable in the way human languages